My name is Paige, 30 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who specializes in dismantling corporate fraud. My husband was in the shower, humming cheerfully when his phone screen illuminated the darkened bedroom. The message read, "Last night meant everything to me." I did not scream. I did not cry. Instead, my professional instincts took over completely. I bypassed his security code, scrolled through months of sickening history, and typed a simple reply. "Come over. She is gone." Minutes later, the doorbell echoed through the house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to turn your heartbreak into a perfectly calculated plan for justice. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, my family viewed me as the boring one. My parents, Mitchell and Diane, built their identities around country club memberships and projecting an image of flawless wealth. My older sister, Chelsea, was their absolute pride and joy. She was a social media influencer perfectly molded to my parents' shallow expectations. I preferred the quiet certainty of numbers. Numbers never lied. Numbers always balanced. I chose a career in forensic accounting because I found comfort in logic and truth. When I married Declan, everyone was shocked. Declan was 34, a high-powered venture capital executive with a charming smile and a wardrobe that cost more than my college tuition. He was flashy, charismatic, and exactly the kind of man my parents worshipped. They praised his aggressive business tactics. I thought his flashy exterior balanced my practical nature. I believed we were a team. I trusted him completely, trusting he valued the quiet, steady life we were building together. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. I was in our master bedroom packing my suitcase, scheduled to fly out to Denver the following morning to lead an audit on an embezzlement case. My suitcase lay open on the mattress, half filled with neutral business suits. The house was quiet, save for the steady drumming of rain against the windows and the sound of the shower running. Declan had just gotten home from a grueling day of investor meetings. He kissed my forehead and vanished into the bathroom. I was folding a blouse when his phone buzzed on the mahogany nightstand. I normally would never look. We had a strict policy respecting each other's privacy, a foundation of trust I thought was unbreakable. But the device buzzed again, vibrating insistently against the wood. I glanced over, thinking it might be his assistant with an urgent document for his morning meeting. Instead, a text bubble floated on the lock screen. The sender was saved as a single heart emoji. The message was glaringly clear. Last night meant everything to me. Time stopped. The air felt impossibly thin. My hands froze over my suitcase. A normal wife might have burst into tears, pounded on the bathroom door, or screamed. But I am an auditor. When I spot a discrepancy, my emotional response shuts down, replaced by cold, hard analysis. I walked to the nightstand and picked up the phone. It was locked with a custom numeric passcode he changed last week, claiming it was a new security protocol. I angled the screen toward the lamp. My eyes traced the oily smudges left by his fingertips over the numbers 258 and 0. A simple vertical swipe down the center of the keypad. The screen unlocked instantly. Men who consider themselves untouchable are often predictable. I opened the app and tapped on the heart emoji. The thread was not a brief lapse in judgment. It was a sprawling, months-long chronicle of absolute betrayal. There were photos, hotel receipts, and explicit conversations dating back to early spring. They met at restaurants I had suggested. They spent weekends together when Declan claimed to be at regional conferences. Every late night at the office, every delayed flight, and every canceled dinner date was documented right here in this digital ledger of deceit. He maintained the facade of a devoted husband while actively building a parallel existence. My chest ached with a suffocating pressure, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Panic is the enemy of strategy. I scrolled to the bottom of the conversation. The unknown woman had just sent another message. "I wish you were here right now. Is she packing yet?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Confronting him now while he was in the shower would result in immediate denial and a scrambling effort to delete the evidence. He would try to make me doubt my sanity. I needed undeniable proof. With deliberate precision, I typed a response mimicking his usual concise style. Come over. She left for the airport early. I hit send. 3 small dots appeared dancing for a moment before her reply materialized. I am already in the neighborhood. Be there in 10. I deleted my message and her response restoring the phone to its exact position on the nightstand. I turned off the glowing screen. I slowly zipped my suitcase shut and pushed it into the corner of the room out of sight. I sat down on the very edge of our large bed, feeling the cool air of the dark room against my skin. The rain continued to beat against the glass, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rush of water from the bathroom. Declan was humming a jazz tune, oblivious that his carefully constructed world was about to detonate. I sat with hands folded in my lap, breathing in slow, measured counts. I cataloged our joint assets, preparing the financial dissection of our marriage. Every heartbeat felt like the ticking of a meticulously wound clock, ticking closer to the moment of absolute, devastating truth. I sat in the quiet storm of my home, listening to the shower running, just waiting patiently for the heavy oak doorbell to finally ring. The chime of the heavy oak doorbell finally shattered the quiet of the house. I stood up from the edge of the mattress, smoothing the fabric of my practical gray slacks. I walked down the curved mahogany staircase, my footsteps completely muffled by the plush runner. The rain was still lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our grand foyer, casting distorted watery shadows across the imported tile. I reached out and pulled the heavy front door open, preparing my face for the sight of a desperate home-wrecking stranger. Instead, the breath was knocked entirely out of my lungs. Standing under the warm golden glow of the porch light, shaking the rain from a $1,000 designer trench coat, was Chelsea, my older sister, the family golden child. Chelsea did not gasp. She did not stumble backwards, cover her mouth in shock, or offer a frantic, tearful apology. She merely looked at me, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across her perfectly contoured face. "You are supposed to be on a plane to Denver right now, Paige," she said, her tone dripping with utter boredom. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She walked straight into my living room, tossing her wet coat onto the pristine white sofa I had spent weeks selecting. Before I could process the sheer audacity of her presence, heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Declan appeared in the entryway, a white towel wrapped loosely around his waist, water droplets clinging to his athletic shoulders. I smelled the sharp citrus notes of the shower gel I had bought for him, mingling with the heavy, expensive floral perfume Chelsea always wore. I waited for the panic. I waited for his eyes to widen in terror, for him to scramble backward and beg for forgiveness. That is what guilty men do when they are caught. But Declan did not freeze. A low, amused chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Well," he said casually, running a hand through his damp hair, "I suppose the schedule changed." He walked right past me. He did not even flinch as his bare arm brushed against my shoulder. He moved directly to the home bar where Chelsea was already pouring herself a glass of my favorite vintage bourbon, a bottle I had specifically saved for our upcoming anniversary. Declan stepped behind her, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He placed a lingering kiss on her skin right in front of me in the middle of our living room. It was not a moment of shame. It was a calculated exhibition. They were flaunting it. "You really need to update your flight tracker app," Declan, Chelsea purred, leaning back into his embrace. "Your boring little wife almost ruined a perfectly good evening." I stood near the entryway, feeling my pulse slow down into a freezing, methodical rhythm. The initial shock evaporated, replaced immediately by the cold, calculating mindset of an auditor examining a deeply fraudulent ledger. The numbers were adding up and the balance was grotesque. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying absolutely zero emotion. Declan took the glass from Chelsea's hand and took a slow sip. "Since last winter. Around the time you were busy auditing that tedious manufacturing firm in Ohio. You are always so consumed by other people's ledgers. Paige, you completely ignored your own household." Chelsea turned to face me, leaning against the marble counter. Her eyes raked over my simple blouse and sensible shoes with unfiltered disgust. "Look at yourself, Paige. You are a forensic accountant. You live in a world of gray suits and endless spreadsheets. Declan is a venture capitalist. He needs glamour. He needs excitement. You were never his equal. You were just a placeholder. I watched them. A gorgeous, utterly toxic pair. A placeholder, I repeated neutrally. Declan nodded, completely unashamed of his own cruelty. My older conservative investors prefer a stable, grounded family man. A quiet, practical wife like you provided the perfect optics for my fund. You were a safe cover story page, a prop to make me look reliable to the board of directors. But Chelsea is my actual life. The absolute ruthlessness of their logic was breathtaking. My sister, the social media darling whom my parents worshipped for her superficial perfection, had been sleeping in my bed, drinking my wine, and plotting with my husband to use my dull, reliable image as a corporate shield. They thought I was weak. They thought my lack of screaming meant I was broken. They did not understand that I was simply gathering data. I crossed my arms over my chest. As I did, I subtly pressed 2 fingers against the face of my smartwatch. A tiny red dot appeared in the corner of the small digital screen. The voice recorder was active, capturing every arrogant word, echoing through the high ceilings of our home. So this whole marriage, I said, projecting a tone of defeated resignation to keep them talking. It was just a business arrangement for you. Declan laughed, pouring himself a fresh drink. Everything is a business arrangement, Paige. You just failed to read the fine print. You provided the boring stability. Chelsea provided everything else. Chelsea stepped forward, trailing a manicured finger along the edge of my dining table. It is honestly embarrassing that it took you this long to figure it out. Mom and Dad always said you lacked basic social awareness. You are so obsessed with finding missing pennies at work that you missed your husband sleeping with your sister right under your nose. Mom and Dad, I murmured, ensuring the watch recorded every single syllable. Do they know? Chelsea threw her head back and laughed, a bright chiming sound that made my blood run absolute ice. Of course they do not know about the actual affair, you idiot, but they know Declan is the only reason this family has any real prestige left. They love him more than they love you. They always have. Declan smirked, tightening his grip on her waist. We were going to transition you out quietly. A clean, amicable divorce where I generously let you keep your little retirement account while I take the real assets. It is a shame you had to be dramatic and cancel your flight. I looked at the man I had pledged my life to, and the sister I had shared a childhood with. There was no remorse in their eyes, only the predatory satisfaction of bullies who believed they held all the power. They viewed me as a pathetic gray little mouse who would quietly pack her bags, hand over the keys to the kingdom, and cry herself to sleep in some cheap motel. They had deeply miscalculated. I was an auditor, and they had just handed me the master key to their absolute destruction. I kept my face entirely blank, letting the smartwatch record the heavy silence that finally settled over the room. The first phase of their betrayal was complete, documented securely on my wrist. But a forensic accountant never stops at the first discrepancy. Now I needed to test the rest of the perimeter. I needed to call our parents to see exactly how deep this family rot truly went. I stepped out of the living room, leaving the two of them clinking their glasses, and walked into the pristine kitchen. My hands were perfectly steady as I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my parents. They lived less than 15 minutes away in a gated subdivision. When my mother answered, I forced my voice to tremble. I manufactured a slight hitch in my breath, asking them to come over immediately because there was a terrible emergency. My mother sounded mildly irritated at the late hour, but promised they were on their way. I ended the call and leaned against the cool granite countertop. 20 minutes. That was all it took for the headlights of my father's leased Mercedes to sweep across the wet driveway. The heavy front door opened, and Mitchell and Diane stepped into the foyer, shaking the rain from their expensive coats. My father wore his usual country club attire, a navy blazer and slacks, while my mother was perfectly styled, her heavy gold jewelry catching the foyer lights. I walked out of the kitchen to meet them. Declan and Chelsea emerged from the living room, standing side by side. Declan still wore nothing but the white towel, and Chelsea was holding her half-empty glass of bourbon. I braced myself for my parents to react. I waited for my mother to gasp, for my father to demand an explanation for why his golden child was half undressed with her sister's husband. Instead, an eerie, suffocating calm settled over the room. My mother sighed a sound of profound annoyance and handed her wet coat to Declan as if he were a bellhop. My father crossed his arms, fixing me with a stern, disappointed glare. Nobody shouted. Nobody demanded answers. They already knew. This is exactly why we wanted to handle this privately. Paige, my mother said, stepping into the living room and taking a seat on a leather accent chair. You always overreact. There is no need for this kind of late-night drama. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a cold chasm open up in the floor beneath my feet. You knew, I stated. The words were flat stripped of the manufactured panic I had used on the phone. Of course we knew, my father said, walking over to the home bar to pour himself a drink. Declan is a pragmatic man. He came to us months ago when he realized this marriage was no longer viable. He wanted to ensure the family remained intact, even if the marital arrangement needed shifting. Shifting, I repeated the sterile corporate buzzword. You are calling my husband sleeping with my sister a shift in the marital arrangement. My mother shot me a look of pure disdain. Oh, please drop the puritanical act, Paige. You are 30 years old, and you dress like a mid-level bank teller. You are rigid. You are utterly boring. Declan needs a partner who can navigate high society, host charity galas, and look the part of a venture capitalist's wife. Chelsea was born for this life. You were just tying him down. I looked at Chelsea. She offered a sickeningly sweet smile and rested her head on Declan's shoulder. And what is the price for your blessing? I asked, turning my attention to my father. You do not bless a scandal like this without a substantial return on investment. You care too much about your country club reputation. So what is the exact dollar amount? My father chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. You always were too smart for your own good, Paige. It is not about a payoff. It is about a strategic partnership. Declan has graciously agreed to inject $10 million into my logistics company. The numbers clicked into place inside my brain with the precision of a combination lock. My father's logistics firm had been bleeding money for 3 years. He was drowning in debt, desperately taking out loans to maintain their lavish lifestyle. Declan was not just buying my sister. He was buying my parents' silence and their absolute loyalty. $10 million, I said smoothly. A venture capital executive throwing $10 million into a failing, outdated shipping firm. That is an incredibly poor investment strategy, Declan. Declan shrugged, completely unbothered. Consider it an angel investment in my future happiness. And since your father's company is absorbing the capital, it makes this whole transition so much smoother. We are keeping the wealth in the family, just a slightly reconfigured family. My mother stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt. So here is how this is going to work. You are going to quietly file for a no-fault divorce. You will cite irreconcilable differences. You will not ask for alimony, and you will certainly not make a public spectacle of this. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, your father and I will publicly state that your mental health has deteriorated and you are prone to paranoid delusions. I looked at the four of them. The absolute moral bankruptcy of the people standing in my home was staggering. My own flesh and blood had sold me out to fund a failing business and secure a place in high society. I will pack my things, I said, turning toward the stairs. I want nothing to do with this house or any of you. Actually, Declan interrupted, his voice dropping into a hard, authoritative register. You will not pack your things. You will pack a single bag. I stopped with my hand on the banister. Half of everything in this house belongs to me. Declan smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. You should really check your local property records, Paige. You assumed we bought this house jointly. But the title was executed under a holding company, an LLC that I registered in Delaware 3 weeks before our wedding. You are not a homeowner. You are just a guest. And your invitation has officially expired. The trap had been set long before I ever walked down the aisle. He had planned this escape route from the very beginning. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, the roof over my head, none of it was legally mine. I was a tenant in my own life. You have exactly 1 hour, my father said, pulling a gold pocket watch from his coat. 1 hour to pack whatever fits into a single carry-on suitcase. If you try to take any joint financial documents, any jewelry Declan purchased, or anything of substantial value, I will personally call the police and have you arrested for theft. My mother nodded in agreement. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Paige. Just pack your sensible little suits and go. I did not argue. I did not waste my breath pleading with people who lacked basic human empathy. I turned my back on them and walked up the stairs. My heart was a block of ice in my chest. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought stripping me of my home and my family would leave me powerless and destitute. But they forgot one crucial detail. I am a forensic accountant. I do not need to steal physical documents when I have a photographic memory for routing numbers, tax identification codes, and IP addresses. I walked into the master bedroom and pulled my small black carry-on from the closet. I bypassed the designer dresses and expensive shoes. I packed 3 changes of clothes, my laptop, my encrypted backup drives, and the smartwatch still strapped to my wrist, which had successfully recorded the entire $10 million extortion conversation. 55 minutes later, I walked back down the stairs. The 4 of them were sitting in the living room laughing about a recent golf tournament. I walked past them without a single glance. I opened the heavy front door, stepped out into the freezing rain, and let the door click shut behind me, ready to tear their empire down to the studs. The freezing rain soaked through my sensible gray slacks within seconds of the front door clicking shut behind me. I stood on the immaculate driveway of the house I had believed was mine, gripping the handle of my single carry-on suitcase. There were no tears left. The shock had burned them all away, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity that felt almost electric. I pulled my phone from my pocket, shielded the screen from the downpour, and hailed a rideshare to the edge of the city limits. I needed to get away from the manicured lawns and watchful eyes of my former neighborhood. 20 minutes later, the luxury of Beacon Hill was replaced by the flickering, buzzing red neon sign of the Starlight Motor Inn. It was the kind of place that asked for payment up front in cash and did not ask for identification. I handed the clerk a crisp $100 bill from the emergency stash I always kept tucked inside my laptop sleeve. He slid a heavy brass room key across the scratched laminate counter without making eye contact. Room 14 smelled of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The floral bedspread had seen better decades, and the single floor lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the peeling beige wallpaper. I placed my dripping suitcase on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. The physical reality of my eviction was settling in, cast out into the night with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and the electronics in my bag. I opened my laptop, the glowing Apple logo, the only bright light in the dim room. I connected to my personal encrypted mobile hotspot, refusing to trust the unsecured motel network. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating directly to the joint banking portal I shared with Declan. The loading icon spun for 2 seconds before the dashboard materialized. The primary checking account balance was 0. The joint savings account was 0. The high-yield investment portfolio we had supposedly built together for our future was completely empty. My forensic training analyzed the transaction history with clinical detachment. Declan had not just stolen the money, he had executed a flawless, legally binding drain of our assets. Over the past 72 hours, he had utilized a series of pre-signed authorization forms and automated wire transfers to route every single penny into an offshore holding account under his exclusive name. He had exploited a standard spousal consent loophole, masking the theft as a consolidated wealth management strategy. To the outside world and to the bank's automated fraud detection systems, it looked like a standard executive asset transfer. I was legally destitute. For one brief, suffocating moment, a wave of profound grief threatened to pull me under. My husband had betrayed me. My sister had taken my place. My parents had sold me out. They had left me to drown. But as I stared at those zeros on the glowing screen, the grief simply evaporated. It was immediately eclipsed by the overpowering, undeniable pulse of my professional instincts. The tears dried before they could even form. A discrepancy had snagged in the back of my mind, a jagged piece of data that refused to fit the narrative. $10 million. My father had gloated that Declan was injecting $10 million into his failing logistics company. As I sat in that dingy motel room, my mind began to run the valuation models. My father's business was practically worthless. It was an outdated, poorly managed shipping firm, drowning in operational debt, plagued by aging fleets and hemorrhaging clients to modern competitors. The company had zero proprietary technology and zero growth potential. Declan was a venture capital shark. He was ruthless, calculating, and obsessed with massive returns on investment. He did not operate on charity, and he certainly did not operate on familial loyalty. There was absolutely no logical reason for a financial predator like Declan to throw $10 million into a sinking ship. It was financial suicide. The math simply did not add up. And when the math does not add up, someone is lying. I stood up, shedding my wet coat, and walked over to the small, scratched wooden desk in the corner of the room. I moved the plastic ice bucket aside and placed my laptop squarely in the center. This was no longer a motel room. It was a digital war room. I plugged my charger into the flickering wall outlet, watching the battery icon jump to life, and booted up my encrypted external hard drives. If Declan was moving $10 million into my father's company, it was not an investment. It was a mechanism. The logistics firm was serving a specific, highly concealed purpose in a much larger financial architecture. I needed to dissect that architecture piece by piece. I opened my command terminal and initiated a secure shell connection routing my IP address through a dozen anonymous servers across the globe to ensure my digital footprint vanished completely. I pulled up the public tax records, state corporate registry filings, and the shipping manifests for my father's business. To a layperson, these databases were impenetrable walls of bureaucratic jargon. To me, they were a vibrant, pulsing map of hidden intentions. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I began compiling the data, cross-referencing my father's declared assets against the venture capital fund's public disbursement reports. I ran a secondary algorithm to scan for shell corporations registered under derivatives of Declan's name. Declan thought he had stripped me of my power when he took my house and my money. He fundamentally misunderstood what my power actually was. My power was the ability to see the invisible threads connecting stolen money to arrogant men. The rain battered against the thin motel window as I typed line after line of specialized search queries. I was going to follow the complex trail of that $10 million through every fake ledger and dummy corporation they had constructed. I was going to find out exactly why a brilliant venture capitalist was buying a worthless logistics company, and when I found the answer, I was going to use it to burn his entire world to ash. The harsh morning sun bled through the thin gap in the motel curtains, casting a sharp yellow glare across my laptop screen. I had not slept a single second. My eyes burned, but my mind was operating at maximum velocity. A sharp, aggressive knock at the door broke the steady hum of the mini-fridge. I stood, my muscles stiff from sitting in the cheap plastic chair all night, and pulled the door open. A man in a wrinkled windbreaker thrust a thick manila envelope against my chest, muttered a legally required confirmation of my identity, and walked away. I locked the door and ripped open the heavy seal. The header of the document was stamped with the logo of the most aggressive, high-priced litigation firm in downtown Chicago. They were divorce papers executed with terrifying speed. Declan had not wasted a single minute. I spread the thick stack of pages across the floral bedspread, reading the terms with the clinical detachment of a professional auditor. It was a masterpiece of legal predation. The documents claimed that I had knowingly signed away all marital rights through a post-nuptial agreement I had never seen embedded within the boilerplate pages of a tax filing he had me sign 2 years ago. The petition sought to assign all joint debt entirely to me while simultaneously freezing my personal credit lines under the guise of pending litigation. He was not just divorcing me. He was ensuring I would be financially paralyzed, unable to retain competent legal counsel, and buried in fabricated liabilities for the next decade. Before I could even process the sheer volume of the legal snare, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden desk. It was an incoming call from my Aunt Sarah. I hit ignore, but the screen instantly lit up again. A text from my cousin Marcus, then an email from my godmother, then a barrage of notifications from our extended family group chat. The influx was a coordinated assault. I opened the chat application and watched the betrayal unfold in real time. My mother Diane had drafted a lengthy, emotionally manipulative message and broadcasted it to every aunt, uncle, and cousin we possessed. The narrative was breathtakingly vicious. Diane claimed with manufactured heartbreak that Declan had discovered I was siphoning funds from his personal accounts to fund a secret gambling addiction. She wrote that I had been caught having a prolonged affair with a junior accountant at my firm. The message painted Declan as the devastated, loyal husband who had tried to save our marriage and framed my parents as the tragic victims of my supposed deception. The replies from my relatives poured in: outrage, disgust, absolute condemnation. People I had known my entire life, people whose weddings I had attended and whose children I had held, were instantly turning their backs on me. They called me toxic. They praised Mitchell and Diane for their strength. They offered Declan their deepest sympathies. My parents had effectively amputated me from the family tree, sealing my isolation so completely that not a single relative bothered to ask for my side of the story. They had projected Chelsea and Declan's exact crimes onto me. I stared at the glowing screen as the notifications continued to pile up. The goal was obvious: psychological warfare designed to break my spirit. They wanted me panicked, crying, and desperately calling relatives to defend my character. They wanted me distracted by gossip while the legal noose tightened around my neck. I picked up the phone, navigated to the settings menu, and engaged the power switch. The screen faded to black. I tossed the useless piece of metal onto the mattress next to the predatory divorce papers. Let them have the family group chat. Let them keep the country club gossip. I did not care about my social standing. I cared about the math. I sat back down at the desk and pulled my laptop closer. The smear campaign and the aggressive legal filings only confirmed my hypothesis. Declan and my father were terrified. The sheer speed and brutality of their attack meant I was a threat they needed to neutralize immediately. They needed me destitute and discredited, so that if I ever tried to expose them, I would look like a bitter, bankrupt, and delusional ex-wife. They were hiding something massive, and it lived inside the digital infrastructure of Mitchell's failing logistics company. I cracked my knuckles and opened a new terminal window. My father's company, Vanguard Freight, operated on an archaic network architecture. Mitchell was notoriously cheap when it came to IT infrastructure, viewing cybersecurity as an unnecessary expense. He relied on a basic commercial firewall and a third-party server host that had not updated its security protocols in 3 years. For a forensic auditor with a background in system vulnerabilities, it was like walking through an unlocked front door. I ran a simple port scan to map the network environment. Within minutes, I identified a vulnerability in their remote desktop protocol, a weak access point used by their warehouse managers to log inventory from home. I deployed a brute force script, letting the automated program cycle through default administrator passwords. It took less than 40 seconds for the system to grant me full access. My father had never bothered to change the factory default credentials. I was in. The digital landscape of Vanguard Freight unfurled across my screen. I bypassed the standard employee directories and the daily shipping logs, driving straight into the financial route directory. I needed the raw, unedited tax filings and the internal ledger accounts. The company's public face showed a business struggling to stay afloat, reporting consecutive quarterly losses and declining revenue streams. But as I pulled up the internal bank reconciliation statements, a glaring anomaly jumped off the screen. The operational accounts were indeed bleeding cash, but there was a secondary, highly restricted ledger buried under a vague file name. I downloaded the entire folder to my encrypted drive, bypassing their automated alert system by throttling my download speed to mimic standard background traffic. I opened the first spreadsheet, my eyes scanning columns of data. The numbers were staggering. Massive unstructured deposits were flowing into Vanguard Freight from a network of untraceable shell companies. Millions of dollars were washing through my father's payroll accounts, disguised as vendor payments and equipment leasing fees. I leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The $10 million Declan had promised was not a one-time investment. It was merely the latest transaction in a continuous high-volume operation. I had just breached the outer wall of their criminal enterprise. I pulled the first batch of corrupted invoices into a master spreadsheet, my keystrokes sharp and precise against the silence of the motel room. The ghost shipments were hidden in plain sight. Mitchell's logistics firm Vanguard Freight was supposedly hauling heavy industrial machinery components across the Midwest. Yet when I cross-referenced the bill of lading numbers against Federal Transportation Way station logs, the trucks simply did not exist. There were no commercial drivers on the payroll matching the route manifests. There was no fuel consumption data to support the massive mileage claimed. It was a phantom fleet carrying invisible cargo. Declan was bleeding capital from his own venture fund. He was skimming off the top of massive tech sector investments, siphoning millions from his elite partners, and routing the embezzled cash into Vanguard under the guise of specialized transport contracts. My father's failing business was nothing but an industrial-sized washing machine. The $10 million lifeline they had gloated about in my living room was not a payoff for my sister taking my place. It was the latest spin cycle in a continuous high-volume operation. I dissected the mechanics of the wash. Mitchell had created fictional subcontractors, shell trucking companies registered to vacant dirt lots in Delaware. He was invoicing Declan's venture capital firm for shipping servers, microchips, and raw materials that never materialized. Declan's fund would pay the exorbitant invoices, effectively transferring stolen investor capital into Vanguard's checking accounts. Once the dirty money landed, Mitchell would mix it with the meager revenues of his legitimate freight runs. He paid taxes on it. He legitimized it. Then he funneled the bulk of it right back out, masquerading as international consulting fees and offshore software licensing purchases. I stared at the digital signatures authorizing the falsified manifests. My father had personally approved every single ghost shipment. My mother, Diane, the woman who had mercilessly criticized my sensible shoes and lack of high society glamour, was the primary signatory on the outgoing wire transfers. I found her digital fingerprints embedded all over the falsified tax documents. She was moving millions of dollars of illicit cash before attending her Tuesday morning charity luncheons. The sheer sociopathy of it was paralyzing. They were not merely greedy socialites turning a blind eye to infidelity. They were active, willing participants in a Class A federal felony: wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. They were risking decades in federal prison just to keep their country club memberships active, their luxury car leases paid, and their fragile societal facade intact. They had sold their youngest daughter to the slaughterhouse without a second thought because I was the only honest variable in their completely fraudulent ecosystem. They despised me not because I was boring, but because I was an auditor. I represented the truth, and the truth was the one thing their empire could not survive. The danger of what I was looking at began to radiate through the screen, making the air in the cheap motel room feel suddenly thin. This was no longer a messy, dramatic suburban divorce. This was a high-stakes financial cartel. Declan was stealing from some of the most powerful institutional investors on the East Coast. His portfolio included sovereign wealth funds and notoriously aggressive private equity groups. If they realized their capital was being bled dry to fund a fake logistics empire, the legal repercussions would be the absolute least of Declan's problems. People had been violently silenced for far less. That explained the ruthless speed of his attack on me. By delivering predatory divorce papers and destroying my reputation simultaneously, he was creating a perfect scapegoat. If the SEC or the FBI ever noticed the discrepancies in his fund, Declan would simply point the finger at his bitter, legally destitute, unstable ex-wife, claiming I had manipulated his accounts out of spite. He was actively framing me for his federal crimes. I pushed the fear aside, sealing it in a mental vault. Panic is the enemy of analysis. I refocused on the outbound capital stream. If Vanguard was retaining a mandatory 10% laundering fee to keep my parents afloat, Where was the remaining 90% going? It had to land somewhere. Money, no matter how aggressively it is scrubbed, always leaves a thermal signature. I bypassed Mitchell's rudimentary firewall and accessed the Swift transfer receipts. The cash was moving in highly structured bursts. It never exceeded federal reporting thresholds, deliberately bypassing algorithmic red flags. The funds shot from a regional bank in Boston to a holding company in the British Virgin Islands masquerading as capital investments in marine technology. From there, the money fragmented. It splintered into dozens of microtransactions, passing through dummy corporations in the Isle of Man, routing through private banking servers in Geneva, before finally coalescing in a series of numbered accounts in Cyprus. It was a classic layering technique designed to blind traditional auditors. But I was not a standard auditor. I was a betrayed spouse fighting for my absolute survival. I was tracking a ghost through a digital maze fighting against banking secrecy laws designed to protect oligarchs. I wrote a custom Python script instructing it to match the exact fractional amounts of the fragmented transfers and reassemble them at their destination point. I paced the length of the motel room, the cheap carpet doing nothing to muffle my rapid footsteps as the progress bar crept across my screen. It took 45 minutes for the script to bypass the final layer of corporate anonymity. When the result finally populated, the breath caught in my throat. The laundered millions were not going back to Declan's personal accounts. They were not funding some secret luxury lifestyle for him and Chelsea. The money was being funneled into a private wealth management trust, registered under a completely different name, tying the entire criminal conspiracy to an origin far deadlier than a simple family betrayal. The name on the master trust document did not belong to a Russian oligarch or a cartel syndicate. It belonged to the Horizon Community Housing Initiative, a domestic nonprofit organization operating out of a modest brick building in downtown Boston. The executive director was Terrence Vance, my brother-in-law. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. Chelsea had married Terrence 5 years ago. She had spent the last half-decade playing the role of the devoted, socially conscious wife, attending charity galas in vintage gowns and posing for local magazine covers alongside him. Terrence was a brilliant, fiercely dedicated architect. He had walked away from lucrative commercial firm offers to build sustainable, affordable housing for marginalized neighborhoods. He was a genuinely good man whose entire life was built on integrity, community service, and lifting others up. And my sister was not only sleeping with my husband, she was actively transforming her own into a federal scapegoat. I pulled up the public tax disclosures for the nonprofit and matched them against the offshore routing numbers. The mechanics of the trap were breathtakingly evil in their precision. The laundered cash from Vanguard Freight was being wire transferred into the Horizon Community Housing Initiative under the guise of massive anonymous philanthropic endowments. Chelsea sat on the board of directors for the organization. She handled the donor relations and the incoming capital allocations. Terrence trusted her implicitly, focusing his energy on zoning board meetings, budget approvals, and construction sites while she managed the bureaucratic machinery. I dug into the digital signatures authorizing the acceptance of these anonymous funds. Every transfer required the executive director's approval. I pulled a legitimate copy of Terrence's signature from a public zoning permit and ran a basic biometric overlay against the signatures on the endowment acceptance forms. The pressure mapping and vector points were entirely wrong. The digital stroke velocity lacked his usual hesitation on the final letter. Chelsea was forging his signature. She was using her proximity, his passwords, and his absolute trust to authorize the intake of millions of dollars in stolen venture capital. The scope of their cruelty was almost incomprehensible. Declan, Chelsea, and my parents were not merely running a financial washing machine, they were building a human shield. When the Internal Revenue Service, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, finally noticed the gaping holes in Declan's venture fund, the forensic trail would bypass him completely. The authorities would track the missing millions through the dummy corporation's breeze, right past the automated ledgers of Vanguard Freight, and find the money sitting squarely in the operating accounts of an inner-city charity. Declan knew exactly how the American justice system operated. He was weaponizing the inherent biases of federal prosecutors. When the audit inevitably triggered, the investigators would not look twice at the wealthy white venture capitalist or the country club logistics owner. Their crosshairs would lock immediately onto the African American charity director with $10 million of unexplained offshore cash sitting in his organizational accounts. Terrence would not just be ruined. He would be paraded through the media, tried and buried under a mountain of federal indictments. He was the perfect expendable fall guy. Chelsea was serving up the man she had vowed to love to protect her affair with my husband. The sheer sociopathy required to execute such a maneuver made my blood run cold. They were going to let an innocent man rot in a federal penitentiary so they could sip champagne on a yacht bought with stolen money. I pushed back from the desk, the cheap motel chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. My hands were shaking not from the cold or the shock of my own eviction, but from pure, unadulterated rage. Declan and my family thought I was a predictable, sensible accountant who would simply pack my bags and disappear into the night. They assumed I would be too busy fighting their fabricated divorce papers and defending myself against my mother's vicious gossip to ever look beneath the surface. They miscalculated. I was an auditor, and an auditor's singular purpose is to find the rot and drag it into the light. I sat back down and opened a secure encrypted messaging platform. I could not simply hand this data over to the authorities. If I pulled the alarm now, the trap would spring exactly as Declan had designed it. Terrence would be holding the bag, his forged signatures providing all the probable cause the federal government needed to arrest him, freeze his assets, and shut down the housing projects that hundreds of families relied upon. I had to dismantle the explosive device from the inside without triggering the detonator. I had to sever Terrence's legal ties to the fraudulent accounts, quarantine the toxic assets, and reroute the liability back to its rightful owners. I began writing a custom extraction script. It was a highly specialized piece of code designed to quietly comb through the Horizon Community Housing Initiative's internal servers and flag every single document bearing Chelsea's digital footprint. I needed to isolate the IP addresses she used to forge the signatures and mirror them directly to Declan's private home network. If I could establish a verifiable digital link between the offshore routing commands and Declan's personal devices, the federal investigation would pivot away from Terrence and slam directly into my soon-to-be ex-husband. The rain outside my motel window had stopped, replaced by the heavy, silent dark of the early morning hours. My screen cast a harsh blue glow across the room as I typed my keystrokes, methodical and unyielding. The grief of losing my marriage had entirely evaporated, burned away by the heat of this new mission. I was no longer fighting just for my own survival or to reclaim my stolen assets. I was fighting to save a good man from being crushed by the monsters who shared my bloodline. The war had escalated, and I was going to ensure that when the dust settled, I would be the only one left standing. I gathered the thick stack of freshly printed ledgers from the cheap inkjet machine I had purchased at an all-night office supply store, shoved the documents into a heavy manila envelope, and walked out into the biting morning air. The drive to the South End took 20 minutes, taking me far away from the polished glass towers of the financial district and into the gritty industrial heart of the city. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of my parents' estate. It was loud, chaotic, and unforgiving. The Horizon Community Housing Initiative's latest project was a massive half-finished apartment complex rising out of a vast crater of excavated dirt and concrete. I parked my rental sedan across the street, the tires crunching loudly over loose gravel. The construction site was deafening. Diesel engines roared, steel beams clanged against each other, suspended from towering cranes, and shouted instructions cut through the mechanical chaos. I spotted Terrence instantly. He was standing near the foundation of the East Wing wearing a scuffed white hard hat and an orange high-visibility vest over a faded thermal shirt. He was arguing passionately with a foreman holding a tablet, gesturing broadly toward a load-bearing pillar. Terrence commanded respect without demanding it. His authority came from the absolute belief in what he was building. Seeing his genuine dedication made the bile rise in my throat. Chelsea was going to burn this man to the ground. I dodged a reversing forklift and navigated the muddy terrain, keeping my head down against the blowing dust. When I reached him, I touched his arm. He turned, his initial annoyance melting into genuine concern when he saw my face. I had not slept, and I looked exactly like a woman who had just had her entire existence dismantled. "Paige," he said, his deep voice carrying over the roar of a nearby cement mixer. "What are you doing here? Chelsea said you were taking time off. She told me Declan filed the papers." He stopped speaking, seeing the cold, unyielding look in my eyes. "I need you to come with me right now," I said, my voice barely audible over the heavy machinery, but sharp enough to slice straight through the ambient noise. "Alone." Terrence frowned, immediately sensing the gravity of my tone. He signaled to the foreman, handing over his tablet, and followed me toward the perimeter of the active site. A row of corrugated metal field offices sat near the chain-link fence. I bypassed the main administrative unit and headed for a small windowless trailer used for storing physical blueprints and excess surveying equipment. I pulled the heavy metal door open, waited for him to step inside, and slammed it shut, sealing us in the dusty, stagnant air. The roar of the construction site was instantly muffled into a low, vibrating hum. "Paige, what is going on?" Terrence asked, taking off his hard hat. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his dark eyes studying me with a mixture of confusion and deep worry. I did not waste time with pleasantries or gentle introductions. There was no soft way to detonate this kind of explosive. I unclasped the manila envelope and spread the printed documents across the slanted drafting table in the center of the room. The harsh fluorescent overhead light illuminated the columns of offshore routing numbers, the SWIFT transfer receipts, and the falsified Vanguard freight tax filings. "You need to look at these," I instructed, pointing to the highlighted sections. "Look at the transaction dates and look closely at the signature authorizations." Terrence stepped closer, leaning his large frame over the table. He was a highly educated man, used to reading complex architectural schematics and municipal budgets. It took him less than a minute to recognize the letterhead of his own organization. "These are Horizon's endowment intake records," he murmured, his brow furrowing in confusion. "But I have never seen these donor profiles. And these routing numbers. Cyprus, the Isle of Man. We do not take international capital." He traced a calloused finger over the final page. "And this signature. It looks exactly like mine, but I did not sign this." "No, you did not," I said, watching his face closely. "Chelsea did. She used your administrative credentials to authorize the intake of $10 million over the past 8 months. The money is coming from my father's failing logistics company, which is acting as a wash for funds embezzled directly from Declan's venture capital firm. Your wife and my husband are stealing from institutional investors, and they are using Horizon as the final dumping ground." Terrence froze entirely. The silence in the small trailer stretched out heavy and suffocating. He stared at the papers, then slowly looked up at me. His expression was a tragic portrait of a man watching his entire reality fracture into pieces. He tried to process the words, tried to find a logical explanation, an administrative error, a banking misunderstanding. But the mathematical proof was absolute. The digital footprint was undeniable. He saw the systematic, calculated forgery of his own name. "Chelsea." He breathed the name, catching painfully in his throat. Disbelief gave way to a profound, hollow devastation. He staggered back a step, his shoulders hitting the metal wall of the trailer. He ran a trembling hand over his face. The woman he loved, the woman he thought shared his mission to uplift this city, had been treating his life's work as a criminal landfill. I watched the devastation curdle into pure, unadulterated fury. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. The veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief against his dark skin. He grabbed the nearest stack of papers and slammed them against the drafting table, the sound echoing sharply in the confined space. "She set me up," he snarled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, quiet intensity. "She sat at my dinner table, she smiled at my mother, she cut the ribbons on these affordable housing units, and she set me up to take the fall for a federal financial crime." He grabbed his hard hat, his eyes wild with rage. I am calling the authorities. I am taking this straight to the district attorney. I will walk into the precinct, hand them these ledgers, and I will testify against all of them. Declan Mitchell Chelsea. I will burn them all down. He reached for the trailer door handle, but I stepped squarely in front of him, blocking his path. You are not going anywhere, I said firmly. He glared down at me, his immense physical presence towering over my frame, but I did not flinch. Get out of my way, Paige. I am not letting them destroy what I have built for this community. If you walk into a police station right now with those ledgers, you will not leave, I countered, my voice icy and precise. You will be arrested before you finish your statement. Terrence, you are not listening to the math. The trap is already perfectly set. You are the executive director. Your name is on the charter. The digital trail leads exclusively to your accounts. The forgeries are mechanically flawless to the naked eye. To an IRS auditor or an FBI financial crimes unit, you look exactly like a corrupt charity director embezzling funds. They will not believe a story about a wealthy venture capitalist and your socialite wife. They will look at the black and white ledgers, they will look at your forged signatures, and they will indict you on the spot. Terrence stopped, his hand hovering over the metal latch. His heavy breathing filled the small room as the brutal reality of his legal peril sank in. He was a black man running an inner-city nonprofit with $10 million of unexplained offshore cash in his operating accounts. The justice system would not grant him the benefit of the doubt. It would absolutely devour him. Declan knows exactly how this looks. I continued, pressing the tactical advantage. He built this structure specifically because you are the perfect fall guy. If you detonate this now, you are handing him the victory. He walks away clean, and you spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary. We cannot use the authorities. Not yet. We have to dismantle the detonation trigger from the inside. We need to isolate the toxic capital and route the forensic liability directly back to Declan's personal servers before the government ever gets wind of the anomaly. Terrence slowly released the door handle. The blinding rage in his eyes shifted, sharpening into a cold, calculated focus. He looked back at the drafting table, at the counterfeit ledgers that represented the execution of his character. He was no longer just a victim. He was an active combatant in a war he had not started, but one he was now fiercely determined to finish. He dragged his gaze from the falsified signatures and met my eyes. The transformation was instantaneous. The idealistic architect vanished, replaced by a man calculating the exact trajectory required to dismantle a bomb. He asked what our next move was. I told him the hardest part of the entire operation was going to happen tonight in his own living room. He had to go back to Chelsea. He had to eat dinner across from her, ask about her day, and smile at the woman actively engineering his incarceration. If she sensed even a fraction of a degree of suspicion if he pulled away or acted cold, she would warn Declan. The laundering operation would vanish, the digital records would be wiped, and the federal government would receive an anonymous tip about the $10 million sitting in the Horizon accounts. Terrence gripped the edge of the drafting table so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was heavy, the sheer physical exertion of suppressing his fury radiating off his frame. He asked how long he had to play the oblivious fool. I told him only as long as it took me to breach Declan's inner sanctum. The offshore routing data I had pulled from the logistics company was just the transit mechanism. It proved the money was moving, but it did not provide the ultimate cryptographic key linking Declan to the creation of the shell corporations. For that, I needed the master ledger. Declan was arrogant, but he was also obsessively controlling. He would never leave the foundational architecture of his embezzlement scheme on a cloud server or a corporate network where a rogue IT administrator could stumble across it. It would be isolated, air-gapped, and stored locally. It lived on his private home server, a custom-built rig bolted into the wall of his home office. I explained the technical roadblock. The home network was protected by military-grade encryption and a hardware firewall that automatically severed outside connections upon detecting unverified ping requests. I could not hack it from a motel room. I needed a physical bridge. I needed to plug a flash drive containing an extraction payload directly into the server's primary USB port. But Declan had locked me out of the house. The alarm access codes had been changed, the biometric locks wiped, and my keys deactivated. Getting inside required a distraction perfectly timed and flawlessly executed. Terrence processed the tactical requirements, his analytical mind quickly shifting to logistics. He offered to host a dinner party, a last-minute celebration for a fabricated grant approval at Horizon. He would invite Declan and Chelsea, insisting it was an intimate gathering to thank them for their continuous anonymous support. The irony was dark and bitter, but it was the perfect bait. Declan's ego would never allow him to decline an opportunity to bask in the adoration of the man he was systematically destroying. While they were drinking Terrence's wine and toasting to affordable housing, the Beacon Hill house would be empty. That was my window. I just needed Terrence to ensure they stayed seated at that dining table for exactly 90 minutes. We moved to the logistics of communication. Standard cell phones were a massive liability. Declan had deep pockets and a paranoid disposition. It was entirely possible he had hired private investigators to monitor my digital communications or deployed spyware to Chelsea's devices to ensure her absolute loyalty. Terrence and I could not risk a single intercepted text message. I reached into my coat pocket and produced 2 prepaid untraceable burner phones purchased with cash at a convenience store an hour prior. I tossed the black plastic device onto the table. I instructed Terrence to leave his primary phone in his truck whenever we needed to speak. The burner was preloaded with an encrypted messaging application disguised as a generic mobile chess game. Every communication had to be coded in the mundane language of construction logistics. If he needed to signal that Chelsea was becoming suspicious, he was to message me about a delay in the drywall delivery. If Declan confirmed attendance for the dinner party, he would approve the cement pour. If the trap was compromised, he would cancel the steel shipment. Terrence picked up the burner phone, turning it over in his large hands. He looked at the cheap plastic, a stark physical representation of the criminal underworld we were now forced to navigate. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his high-visibility vest. He looked at me, the shared betrayal forming an unbreakable silent pact between us. We were no longer just in-laws connected by a marriage that had been a lie. We were a 2-person insurgency operating entirely off the grid. I gathered the printed ledgers, carefully sliding them back into the manila envelope. I gave him one final instruction. He had to be completely flawless. Chelsea was highly perceptive, trained by years of hiding her own sociopathy behind a dazzling smile. She would be searching for micro-expressions, subtle shifts in his vocal tone, a hesitation in his touch. He had to suppress every instinct of self-preservation and lean deeply into the illusion of a happy, trusting marriage. He had to look at the woman holding the knife to his back and convince her he felt nothing but love. Terrence buttoned his thermal shirt and secured his hard hat back onto his head. The community architect was gone, the soldier remained. He gave a single curt nod, confirming he understood the catastrophic stakes of our agreement. He reached for the heavy metal door, pushing it open to let the deafening roar of the construction site flood back into the small space. I watched him walk back out into the dirt, and the noise, his posture relaxed, his stride confident and steady. He was heading straight back into the arms of the enemy, armed with nothing but the brutal truth and a cheap plastic phone. I lingered in the shadows of the trailer for a moment longer, letting my heart rate stabilize before slipping out the secondary gate and returning to my rental car. The first phase of the counterstrike was locked into place. The board was set. Now I needed to figure out how to break into a fortress. I needed the schematics of my own home, or rather, the fortress Declan had turned it into. I spent the next several hours in the motel mapping out the electrical grids, the security camera blind spots, and the hardwired alarm failsafes from memory. The technical execution had to be flawless. I was in the middle of diagramming the centralized smart hub architecture when my focus was brutally interrupted. I had briefly powered on my personal cell phone, the device I had otherwise left dead, to maintain operational security, simply to extract a 2-factor authentication code for my network mapping software. The moment the cellular modem established a connection to the local tower, the lock screen vanished under an avalanche of notifications. It was not a coded message from Terrence regarding building supplies. It was a barrage of direct messages from Chelsea, followed by automated alerts from social media platforms. I clicked the top notification, and the screen flooded with professional high-resolution photography. It was an Instagram post uploaded mere hours ago, and the aesthetic was sickeningly curated. The lighting was a soft, expensive sepia. Sprawling bouquets of white hydrangeas and imported orchids framed the shot. In the center, Chelsea was draped in a clinging silk slip, resting her perfectly manicured hands over a barely visible yet unmistakably pronounced curve of her stomach. Declan stood close behind her, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist, his chin resting near her shoulder. He was wearing the custom-tailored navy suit I had purchased for our 3rd wedding anniversary. The caption was a masterclass in performative joy, detailing their unexpected blessing and a new chapter of authentic love. She tagged Declan her location and several high-profile baby boutiques, ensuring maximum digital visibility. The public applause was instantaneous. Hundreds of comments poured in from our shared social circles, validating their treachery with endless streams of heart emojis and sycophantic congratulations. The second photo in the digital carousel was a jagged, twisting knife. It was a geotagged shot from Barclays Prime, the most exclusive, notoriously expensive steakhouse in the city's financial district. The image captured a long mahogany dining table groaning under the weight of iced seafood towers, Wagyu tomahawks, and vintage champagne. At the head of the table sat my father Mitchell, holding a crystal flute high in the air, his face flushed with triumphant, arrogant laughter. Next to him was my mother Diane, leaning across the table to touch Chelsea's arm with an expression of deep, maternal devotion. I had never, not once in 32 years, been on the receiving end of that specific look. They were throwing a joint engagement and baby shower. My parents were openly, proudly financing a lavish celebration for the woman who was sleeping with my husband and the man who was actively framing their other son-in-law for federal money laundering. The sheer audacity of the gathering was a calculated maneuver. Mitchell and Diane were cementing the new family hierarchy in public. By hosting this opulent dinner at Barclays, they were signaling to the city's elite that Chelsea was the chosen daughter, the heir apparent to their fraudulent social dynasty, while effectively burying my existence. I zoomed in on the background of the image, scanning the blurred faces. The guest list included Declan's venture capital partners and several key board members from the Horizon Community Housing Initiative. Terrence was nowhere to be seen. Chelsea had likely sent him on a fabricated errand, keeping the sacrificial lamb isolated on a job site while she drank champagne with his executioners. As I stared at the frozen smiles of my betrayers, the text messages from Chelsea began to rapid fire across my screen. She was not satisfied with public adulation. She possessed a pathological need to ensure I witnessed her victory firsthand. The messages were relentless, dripping with venom and unchecked arrogance. She asked if I had seen the announcement. She typed that Declan had never been this happy, bragging that he actually wanted this baby, deliberately highlighting that he had never wanted to start a family with me. A new message chimed, detailing how my mother and father were buying them custom nursery furniture the next morning, gloating about how relieved my parents were that Declan was finally with a woman who understood their world. The final text was a blunt, brutal directive. She told me I was out, that I had no husband, no money, and no family left. She ordered me to sign the divorce papers and disappear before they decided to take whatever pathetic scraps I still possessed. The glowing white text glared at me in the dim motel room, daring me to react. Every human instinct I possessed screamed at me to type back, to hurl insults, to threaten her with the absolute devastating ruin I was currently orchestrating. I wanted to shatter her smug superiority. I wanted to tell her that her billionaire husband was a thief, her parents were complicit felons, and her pristine life was a fragile house of cards rigged with high explosives. I closed my eyes, the harsh neon light from the parking lot bleeding through my eyelids. Action driven by ego is how criminals get caught. Declan and Chelsea were operating on pure arrogance. They believed they were utterly untouchable. If I engaged, if I showed even a microscopic fraction of my hand, their paranoia would override their pride. They would scrub the servers, move the offshore assets, and leave Terrence holding the bag immediately. I pressed the power button, plunging the phone back into digital darkness. I engaged in absolute unbroken radio silence. I did not shed a single tear. The sorrow of losing my family had been completely incinerated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, metallic fury. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors I had rigged on the flimsy desk. I fed the visual of my parents laughing at the steakhouse directly into the furnace of my focus. I needed a backdoor into Declan's network. The biometric locks on our house were managed by an external security firm, but the local network running his custom server was integrated into the home's smart automation protocol. Declan prized convenience just as highly as he prized security. He had tied the climate control, the lighting, and the perimeter alarms to a single centralized hub. It was a fortress with a digital drawbridge. I began coding a localized network spoof. If I could not break through the firewall from the outside, I would make the server believe I was already inside. I wrote a script to emulate the MAC address of Declan's own primary laptop. I mapped the exact configuration of his security gateway, programming a sequence that would mimic a standard diagnostic routine to force an automated handshake. It required extreme physical proximity. I had to be within 30 feet of the router to establish the bridge. That meant standing in the freezing dark of the alleyway behind my own house while Terrence distracted them with his dinner party. The volume of technical preparation was staggering, but Chelsea's mocking texts provided an inexhaustible reservoir of stamina. Every line of code I compiled was a nail in their collective coffin. Every firewall bypass I engineered was a direct counterstrike to their steakhouse celebration. They thought they had amputated me from the family tree. They had no idea that by stripping away my past, my marriage, and my bloodline, they had simply removed all my blind spots. The extraction payload was finished by dawn, sitting quietly on an encrypted flash drive. I was ready to bring the fortress down. I passed the microscopic device across the scarred laminate table of a diner on the outskirts of the city. Terrence stared at the sliver of black plastic and metal resting on the formica. It was no larger than a thumbnail, a custom-built bypass drive designed to hijack the hardware firewall of my former home. I explained that it contained a localized spoofing script. Once inserted into the primary USB port of Declan's home office router, it would blind the security gateway, allowing me to remotely extract the master ledger from the alleyway without triggering the internal alarms. Terrence picked up the drive, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger, his expression hardening into absolute resolve. The official engagement dinner was hosted the following evening in a private, velvet-draped dining room at the Obsidian Club. Chelsea had orchestrated this secondary, highly exclusive celebration to solidify her newly acquired social supremacy among the city's elite. Terrence had secured his presence by offering a formal, civilized truce. It was a calculated gamble entirely reliant on Declan's pathological arrogance. The prospect of his vanquished rival publicly bowing out, offering a peaceful separation to protect the Horizon Initiative from messy collateral damage, was a narcotic Declan simply could not refuse. Terrence walked into the lion's den wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his demeanor radiating an aura of calm, weary acceptance. He played the part of the broken but pragmatic man flawlessly. He shook Declan's hand with a firm professional grip. He offered a polite, distant smile to the woman who was systematically engineering his federal incarceration. Throughout the first two courses, Terrence sat near the foot of the long mahogany table, projecting the image of a man prioritizing his community housing project over his shattered marriage. He agreed to property settlements, nodded at Mitchell's condescending advice regarding moving forward, and swallowed his pride with every bite of seared scallops and caviar. His performance was an absolute masterclass in suppressed rage. Chelsea watched him with a triumphant, glittering gaze, fully believing she had completely neutralized her former husband. As the main courses were cleared, the champagne began to flow with reckless abundance. Waitstaff moved invisibly through the room, filling crystal flutes. Mitchell stood at the head of the table, tapping his knife against his glass to demand silence for an elaborate, boastful toast. This was the window. Terrence checked his watch, feigning a sudden look of deep concern. He pulled his phone from his breast pocket, muttering apologies to the guests seated beside him about an urgent, unavoidable call from the city zoning commissioner regarding the South End excavation site. Declan waved him off with a dismissive flick of his wrist, too captivated by Mitchell's booming praise to care about a construction delay. Terence slipped out of the dining room and moved swiftly through the opulent lobby of the club. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind him, the facade of the defeated ex-husband evaporated. He sprinted toward his truck parked in the adjacent garage, his movements sharp and violently precise. He had exactly 45 minutes to cross the city breach of Fortress and return before anyone noticed his extended absence. The drive to Beacon Hill was a blur of neon streetlights and erratic evening traffic. Terence navigated the narrow cobblestone streets with aggressive efficiency, cutting the engine a block away from my former residence to avoid triggering the perimeter audio sensors. He moved through the freezing shadows of the alleyway, finding the secondary garden entrance just as I had mapped it out for him. Declan had spent a fortune upgrading the digital security of the main doors, but had completely ignored the mechanical vulnerability of the wrought iron gate. Terence bypassed the rusted latch with a heavy-duty tension wrench, slipping into the dark, manicured courtyard without making a sound. He approached the back door, punching in the 6-digit override code I had provided. It was a backdoor sequence hard-coded into the system firmware, something Declan was entirely unaware of. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy metallic thud. Terence stepped into the pitch-black kitchen, his boots silent on the imported marble tile. The house was dead quiet save for the low rhythmic hum of the centralized climate control. He moved down the hallway with predatory silence, navigating the familiar layout, relying purely on the ambient light filtering through the high windows. He reached the home office at the end of the corridor. The heavy oak door was unlocked. Terence pushed it open, stepping into Declan's inner sanctum. The room smelled of expensive leather and cold electronics. Built directly into the custom shelving unit on the far wall was the server rack. A chaotic tangle of Ethernet cables and glowing LED indicators pulsed in the darkness. Terence approached the rig, his eyes scanning the hardware for the primary gateway router I had sketched for him. He located the central unit, a heavy black box humming with data processing power. His hand was perfectly steady as he reached into his pocket and retrieved the microscopic USB drive. He found the auxiliary port on the back of the router and pushed the drive into the slot. It clicked securely into place. A tiny green light on the edge of the plastic casing blinked once, then held steady. The firewall had been bypassed. The bridge was open. Terence did not linger a single second longer than necessary. He retraced his steps through the silent house, locked the deadbolt, and vanished back into the freezing alleyway. He sprinted back to his truck, the adrenaline surging through his veins as he threw the vehicle into gear and tore back toward the financial district. Back at the Obsidian Club, the speeches were finally winding down. Mitchell was concluding his verbose monologue just as Terence slipped quietly back through the velvet drapes of the private dining room. He took his seat seamlessly, offering an apologetic smile to the table. Chelsea glanced at him, her eyes slightly glassy from the vintage champagne, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic security breach that had just occurred. Waiters began circling the table, placing intricate spun-sugar desserts in front of the guests. Terence picked up his fork, slicing into a molten chocolate cake. He caught Declan's gaze from across the table and offered a polite deferential nod. The trap was set, the executioner was blind, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The moment Terence's bypass drive clicked into the physical port of the router, a single green indicator flared to life on my secondary monitor. The diagnostic script I had coded executed flawlessly, slicing through the hardware firewall and establishing a secure encrypted tunnel directly into Declan's local network. I sat in the dim, suffocating air of the motel room, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The interface immediately prompted a secondary authentication protocol, a localized biometric failsafe designed to lock down the directory. I had anticipated this exact strain of paranoia. I deployed a mirrored token, a ghost key I had harvested from his primary laptop weeks before the implosion of my marriage. The screen blinked once, the aggressive red warning dissolving into a calm, welcoming gray directory. Access was granted. I was inside the fortress. Declan's digital filing system was a labyrinth of nested folders deliberately obfuscated by alphanumeric strings that mimicked corrupted data sectors. I ran a decryption algorithm, watching the gibberish translate into readable text. He had partitioned the server into heavily compartmentalized vaults. I bypassed the folders containing his standard venture capital portfolios and municipal real estate acquisitions. Those were his legitimate fronts, the pristine, polished armor hiding the rot festering underneath. I was hunting for the anomalous data packets, the hidden partitions that did not align with his public filings. I found the discrepancy buried under a directory cleverly disguised as a repository for legacy software updates. It was a single, heavily encrypted spreadsheet file labeled simply with the word Apex. It took the brute force cracking software 12 agonizing minutes to shatter the file's encryption shell. When the spreadsheet finally rendered on my screen, the sheer monolithic volume of the data nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh blue light illuminating thousands of rows of international routing numbers, cascading investment portfolios, and fictitious return yields. This was the master ledger. What it contained was infinitely worse than a simple embezzlement operation designed to bleed my father's logistics company. Declan was running a global Ponzi scheme. I scrolled through the records, my eyes tracking the massive incoming wire transfers. Tens of millions of dollars were pouring in from sovereign wealth funds, European pension portfolios, and private equity syndicates based in Dubai and Tokyo. He had promised these institutional backers astronomical guaranteed returns on exclusive tech startups and proprietary medical innovations. But the money was never invested into any actual companies. He was using the fresh capital from new international investors to pay fabricated dividends to his early backers. It was a classic aggressive pyramid structure, keeping the illusion of massive profitability alive, while he quietly skimmed tens of millions into his personal offshore accounts to fund his billionaire lifestyle. The scale of the fraud was staggering. Looking at the aggregate totals at the bottom of the spreadsheet, I realized we were looking at a deficit of nearly $400 million. The entire venture capital firm was a hollow shell, a spectacular illusion propped up entirely by stolen money and falsified audit reports. But a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude required a constant, rapidly accelerating influx of new capital to survive, and Declan's intake had begun to plateau. The deficit was growing too fast to hide. The collapse was mathematically inevitable. He needed a catastrophic exit strategy, a massive liquidity event to wash the stolen funds and evaporate before the international syndicates realized their money was gone. I cross-referenced the Apex ledger with the recent board meeting minutes from my father's company, Vanguard Freight. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening mechanical precision. The impending merger between Declan's firm and Vanguard was not a strategic business partnership. It was the final, fatal mechanism of the cash-out phase. Mitchell was desperate to save his failing logistics empire, willingly blinding himself to the glaring anomalies in Declan's financials, just to secure the capital injection. Declan was using Vanguard's legitimate decades-old corporate infrastructure to absorb his venture capital firm's toxic assets. Once the merger finalized, Declan would liquidate his newly acquired majority shares legally, washing his embezzled millions through the acquisition payout. But a crime of this magnitude required a sacrificial lamb. Someone had to face the wrath of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal authorities, and the furious international investors when the phantom returns dried up and the firm defaulted. I pulled up the final tab of the master ledger, examining the offshore routing architecture. The $10 million funneled into the Horizon Community Housing Initiative was just the primer. Declan had pre-programmed a sequence of automated wire transfers scheduled to trigger the exact moment the Vanguard merger closed. The entire $400 million deficit was going to be aggressively routed through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands directly into Horizon's charitable endowment accounts. Terrence was never just a convenient dumping ground for stolen pocket change. He was being positioned as the mastermind of the entire global fraud. Declan had forged Terrence's administrative signatures on every single dummy corporation handling the international funds. When the investors came looking for their missing hundreds of millions, the forensic accountants would follow the digital breadcrumbs straight to the inner-city nonprofit. The narrative was already flawlessly written. The authorities would see a rogue community director exploiting his philanthropic status to orchestrate a massive international swindle. Declan would walk away a wealthy, legitimate businessman who had unfortunately merged with a compromised asset. My father's company would take the immediate bankruptcy hit, but Terrence would take the federal indictment and a life sentence. I initiated a mass download of the entire Apex ledger, copying the raw data, the IP logs, and the forged authorization signatures onto my secure encrypted physical drive. I had the absolute smoking gun. I had the cryptographic proof linking the phantom portfolios directly to Declan's local server and his personal biometric keystrokes. Chelsea had gleefully mocked my shattered existence, believing she had secured a lifetime of limitless wealth and power. She was actually legally bound to a man orchestrating one of the largest financial frauds in the city's history. And my father, blinded by his own arrogance and desire for social supremacy, was gleefully handing over the keys to his legacy, acting as the eager accomplice to his own destruction. I severed the connection, extracting the ghost key and meticulously wiping the temporary tunnel from the router's memory logs. The fortress remained undisturbed, the digital alarms entirely oblivious to the breach. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, watching the progress bar complete the final data transfer. The evidence was secured. The master ledger was mine. Declan's entire criminal empire was resting in the palm of my hand, waiting for the perfect moment to be weaponized. I picked up the untraceable burner phone and sent a single coded message to Terrence. Delivery confirmed. The burner phone screen went dark, but the faint green glow of my secondary monitor continued to wash over the cheap motel walls. I pushed the plastic device aside and immediately pivoted back to the keyboard, my mind shifting from the adrenaline of extraction to the cold, absolute precision of weaponization. I had possession of the master ledger, but data alone was not a killing blow. Declan and Mitchell were heavily insulated by an army of corporate attorneys and PR fixers. If I merely leaked the spreadsheet to the press or handed it to a prosecutor, they would bury it under years of litigation claim, a targeted cyber attack, and manipulate the narrative until they walked away with a fine. A conventional attack would not suffice. I needed a mechanism that would execute their financial ruin instantaneously, irreversibly, and by their own hands. My eyes scanned the underlying directory architecture I had pulled from Declan's local server. I was looking for the integration points, the digital tethers connecting his isolated home rig to his public-facing corporate infrastructure. Declan's obsession with control and efficiency meant he despised manual data entry. He automated everything. I found exactly what I was hunting for buried within a string of automated execution protocols, the active synchronization keys for the shared cloud network utilized by his venture capital firm and Vanguard Freight. This was the neutral digital territory where Declan and my father were finalizing the architectural framework of their impending merger. I used the extracted authentication tokens to slip past the enterprise-grade firewalls, moving into the shared directory like a ghost in the machine. The cloud environment was a massive repository of legal boilerplate asset declarations and corporate restructuring schedules. I bypassed the standard PDFs and text documents, scrolling directly to the core of the transaction. Declan was an arrogant pioneer of decentralized finance. He did not rely on traditional banking officers to execute his large-scale capital transfers. He utilized digital smart contracts. These were highly complex, self-executing lines of code stored on a private blockchain ledger. The moment the merger documents received the cryptographic digital signatures from both the acquiring party and the seller, the smart contract would automatically execute the programmed asset transfers without any need for human oversight or manual banking approvals. Declan had engineered this system to ensure that his $400 million deficit would wash through Vanguard's logistics infrastructure and dump into Terrence's nonprofit the absolute millisecond the ink dried on the merger. It was designed to be instantaneous and unstoppable. I was going to use his own weaponized efficiency to annihilate him. I opened the back-end compiler for the primary smart contract, bringing up the raw hexadecimal code that dictated the flow of the illicit capital. I could not simply delete the routing protocols. A broken contract would trigger an automated error report halting the merger and giving Declan time to investigate. I could not redirect the funds to an offshore account of my own. That would merely transform me into a fugitive and leave Terrence vulnerable to the inevitable federal fallout. The counterstrike required absolute legal finality. I needed to build a guillotine. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys as I began to draft a deeply buried self-executing algorithmic amendment. I was writing a poison pill. I isolated the specific lines of code that established the destination coordinates for the massive influx of offshore capital. Carefully, surgically, I deleted the routing numbers associated with the Horizon Community Housing Initiative, severing Terrence from the blast radius entirely. In their place, I inputted a very specific, highly secure sequence of routing digits. I was not sending the money to a shell corporation or a hidden vault in the Cayman Islands. I was linking the smart contract directly to an active, heavily monitored holding account operated by the United States Department of the Treasury. I did not stop at simply rerouting the cash. A random deposit of that magnitude would trigger a standard administrative hold, eventually allowing Declan's lawyers to file an injunction and claim a routing error. The trap had to be legally binding and totally irrevocable. I manipulated the metadata surrounding the transaction classification. I hard-coded a specific federal tax statute into the executable file, wrapping the entire $400 million transfer in the unyielding language of an IRS Title 26 forfeiture protocol. I was transforming their corporate merger into a voluntary compliance surrender. I reviewed the logic of the manipulated code, ensuring the execution pathway was flawless. The mechanics of the trap were brutally poetic. When Declan and Mitchell gathered in their polished boardroom to finalize the acquisition, they would apply their verified cryptographic signatures to the digital tablet, believing they were sealing their triumph. Instead, those signatures would act as the detonation signal. The smart contract would instantly seize every single dollar of the illicit Ponzi capital bypass all offshore laundering channels and dump the entirety of the stolen funds straight into federal custody. Because of the specific legal markers I had embedded in the back-end code, the system would register the transfer as a willing, unprompted surrender of criminal proceeds. The moment the transaction cleared, the money would be permanently locked in a federal seizure account. Declan's Ponzi scheme would instantly run dry, triggering an immediate catastrophic default across his entire international investor portfolio. Simultaneously, the Treasury Department would receive an automated, undeniable digital receipt for a massive forfeiture of illegal assets, complete with Declan and Mitchell's verified signatures acting as a full confession. They would be legally and financially incinerated before they even finished shaking hands. I spent the next hour meticulously covering my tracks. I matched the exact file weight of the modified smart contract to the original, ensuring no automated security sweeps would detect a discrepancy in the code density. I buried the poison pill execution sequence beneath layers of dense, innocuous legal formatting regarding warehouse liability and freight depreciation. To the naked eye, the contract appeared completely untouched. It looked exactly like the golden ticket my father and my husband had spent months engineering. I initiated the upload sequence, overriding the original file in the shared cloud directory with my weaponized clone. The progress bar filled the screen, a quiet, glowing executioner, making its way into the heart of their empire. I watched the transfer complete the system, returning a silent confirmation that the new file had successfully integrated into the merger queue. The trap was primed. The explosive was planted squarely beneath their seats. All that remained was for the two most arrogant men I had ever known to pick up a pen and eagerly sign their own death warrants. To guarantee that those digital signatures landed exactly where I needed them, the battlefield had to shift from software engineering to psychological warfare. The smart contract was armed and buried deep within their server, but it required a specific, highly authenticated environment to execute its lethal payload without triggering Declan's localized security sweeps. If they utilized their standard commercially available document signing software, the built-in compliance checkers might flag the buried IRS routing numbers before the transaction finalized. I needed them to process the merger through a bespoke impenetrable portal, a gateway I controlled completely. I spent the remaining hours of the morning coding a flawless mirror image shadow domain of an invite-only digital escrow platform known as Sovereign Ledger Protocol. It was a service utilized almost exclusively by Tier 1 financial institutions, sovereign wealth managers, and ultra-high net worth syndicates. It was the digital equivalent of a velvet-roped subterranean Swiss bank vault. I crafted the front-end architecture to radiate exclusivity and institutional prestige, while the back-end was hardwired directly into my poison pill mechanism. I just needed to hand them the poisoned apple, and I needed them to take a massive, eager bite. That required a perfectly orchestrated collision. Terrence was the ideal delivery mechanism. He understood my father's psychological architecture better than anyone. Mitchell was a man driven entirely by the perception of status. He did not just want to be wealthy, he possessed a pathological need to be recognized as part of the untouchable elite. Terrence knew exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. The following morning, Terrence positioned himself in the mahogany-paneled espresso lounge of the Sentinel Athletic Club. It was a bastion of old money posturing where Mitchell routinely held court after his Wednesday morning squash matches. Terrence sat at a corner table dressed in a muted, impeccably tailored suit, projecting the aura of a man who was quietly, gracefully moving on with his life. When Mitchell walked into the lounge, flush with the adrenaline of a physical workout and the impending triumph of his corporate acquisition, Terrence did not avoid his gaze. Instead, he offered a polite, deferential nod, silently inviting the older man to gloat. Mitchell could never resist an opportunity to exercise his perceived dominance. He approached Terrence's table, ordering his espresso with a snap of his fingers, before looking down at his former son-in-law. Mitchell offered a few sentences of condescending faux sympathy, praising Terrence for handling the divorce and the subsequent shifting of family loyalties with such pragmatic maturity. Terrence absorbed the patronizing remarks effortlessly, playing the role of the humbled, pragmatic subordinate. He agreed that the Horizon Community Housing Initiative was his primary focus, now letting Mitchell believe that the community director had fully capitulated. Then, with surgical precision, Terrence pivoted the conversation to the Vanguard Apex merger. He congratulated Mitchell on the scale of the impending acquisition, speaking with a tone of hushed, respectful awe. He fed my father's ego a steady diet of admiration, inflating Mitchell's sense of unassailable supremacy. Once Mitchell was thoroughly intoxicated by his own reflection, Terrence dropped the hook. He casually mentioned a passing anecdote about a recent highly publicized real estate acquisition his nonprofit had facilitated. Terrence noted with a slight exasperated sigh that they had nearly lost the nine-figure endowment because a standard digital signature had failed an international compliance audit. He took a sip of his coffee, looking at Mitchell with entirely manufactured earnestness. He then smoothly remarked that his board of directors now explicitly mandated the use of Sovereign Ledger Protocol for all transactions exceeding $100 million. Terrence described the service as a necessity for anyone operating at the absolute pinnacle of global finance. He emphasized that it was an elite encrypted notary environment so exclusive that it required a board-level referral just to access the login portal. He painted it not merely as a software tool, but as a rigid status symbol, the definitive line separating provincial mid-level businessmen from true international titans. He looked at Mitchell, his expression perfectly open, and asked if Vanguard's legal team had already secured their sovereign ledger allocation for the Apex merger. I could practically see the panic flash behind my father's eyes through Terrence's later recounting of the interaction. Mitchell had absolutely no idea what Sovereign Ledger Protocol was, but his towering hubris strictly forbade him from admitting ignorance to a man he considered his inferior. To admit that Vanguard Freight was preparing to finalize a multi-hundred-million-dollar international merger using pedestrian commercially available software was a profound insult to his fragile ego. Mitchell quickly recovered his composure, adjusting his posture and offering a vague dismissive wave of his hand. He lied seamlessly, stating that their legal team was currently reviewing several elite cryptographic options, but that he was dissatisfied with their current recommendations. Terence feigned a look of sudden helpful realization. He generously offered to have his administrative team forward an exclusive invitation link to the Sovereign platform, framing the gesture as a professional courtesy between parting associates. He suggested it would save Mitchell the administrative headache of enduring the standard vetting process. Mitchell, utterly desperate to secure the digital status symbol and maintain his facade of supreme insider knowledge, accepted the offer with a tight, arrogant smile. The psychological trap snapped shut with devastating effectiveness. Mitchell took the invitation link directly to Declan's downtown office. Declan, for all his sophisticated technical paranoia, was fundamentally blinded by his desire to impress his new father-in-law and solidify his position within the family dynasty. When Mitchell presented the Sovereign Ledger Protocol as a mandatory elite requirement for finalizing their historic merger, Declan did not initiate a deep-dive forensic audit of the platform's back-end architecture. He looked at the flawless, institutional-grade user interface I had designed, saw the mirrored security certificates, and allowed his own greed to override his operational security protocols. The platform radiated the exact kind of untouchable cryptographic exclusivity that Declan craved. Sitting in the dim glow of my motel room, I watched the incoming traffic logs on my secondary monitor. The command terminal remained silent for hours, the anticipation thick and heavy in the stale air. Then, shortly after 3 in the afternoon, the digital snare registered a vibration. A secure ping illuminated the screen. Declan's IP address had connected to the spoofed domain. I held my breath, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, watching the data packets stream through the encrypted tunnel. The progress bar flared bright green. Guided entirely by their own unyielding arrogance and an insatiable hunger for prestige, Mitchell and Declan willingly uploaded the entirety of their multi-million-dollar corporate merger contracts directly into my invisible snare. The document synchronized with the waiting smart contract, locking the poison pill securely into the very foundation of their agreement. The bait had been swallowed whole. With the trap fully armed within the blockchain, the digital warfare concluded. Now the physical theater required my attendance. Dismantling their financial empire from the shadows of a neon-lit motel room was necessary for the execution, but to truly sever the parasitic hold they had on my life, I needed to look them in the eye as the floor fell out from beneath them. The stage for this public reckoning was the Lumina Gallery, a cavernous multi-tier exhibition space situated in the wealthiest sector of the downtown arts district. Declan had rented the entire venue for a dual-purpose spectacle, the official launch of his newly restructured venture capital fund, and the formal, highly publicized celebration of his engagement to my sister. The evening air was biting as I stepped out of a hired black sedan a block away from the venue. A heavy velvet rope barricaded the main entrance, flanked by a swarm of private security contractors and local paparazzi, hungry for shots of the city's power brokers. Terence, operating with the quiet, invisible efficiency that had always been his hallmark, had bypassed the guest list restrictions flawlessly. I avoided the flashbulbs at the front and approached a secondary side entrance meant for catering staff and gallery curators. I slid the cloned VIP magnetic credential Terence had encrypted for me through the card reader. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying metallic finality. I bypassed the bustling kitchens and slipped into the dim, acoustically dampened corridor leading directly to the main exhibition floor. I had shed the utilitarian anonymity of my motel room existence. For this execution, I required armor woven from pure defiance. I wore a floor-length backless gown of liquid crimson silk. It was a violently striking, uncompromising shade of red that demanded attention and refused to offer any apologies. The fabric clung to my frame, trailing slightly against the polished concrete floors. My hair was swept back in a severe, immaculate twist, and my makeup was sharp, cold, and flawless. I did not look like the discarded, heartbroken ex-wife they had tried to bury under a mountain of humiliation. I looked like the architect of their impending ruin. I paused at the threshold of the grand ballroom, taking in the scale of their hubris. The gallery was a cathedral of curated excess. Massive, provocative, contemporary canvases hung on the stark white walls, illuminated by precise, dramatic spotlights. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully through the dense crowd, offering flutes of imported champagne and gold-leafed hors d'oeuvres. The room was a staggering collection of the municipal elite, state senators, hedge fund managers, tech executives, and the city's most influential socialites. These were the very marks Declan intended to bleed dry. A classical string quartet was positioned on a raised dais near the center of the room, playing a lively, sophisticated Vivaldi piece that hovered pleasantly above the din of $100,000 conversations. I stepped out of the shadows and into the glaring, unsparing light of the main floor. The reaction was not an immediate explosion, but rather a swift, localized paralysis that rippled outward from my point of entry. A venture capitalist I recognized from a previous charity gala was the first to notice me. He stopped mid-sentence, his champagne flute hovering inches from his mouth, his eyes widening in poorly concealed shock. The silence cascaded through the room like a physical wave. Conversations abruptly died. Heads turned. The dense throng of wealthy investors and social climbers naturally, almost instinctively parted to clear a direct path for me. On the raised dais, the lead violinist of the quartet caught the sudden suffocating shift in the room's atmosphere. His bow faltered against the strings, producing a harsh, discordant scrape. The cellist completely lost the tempo, and within seconds the music sputtered and died, leaving only the deafening silence of 100 people holding their breath. I walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete. The red silk of my gown flared like a signal fire against the monochromatic sea of black tuxedos and subdued cocktail dresses. I kept my chin elevated, my gaze fixed dead ahead, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying serenity. At the far end of the gallery, positioned beneath a massive abstract sculpture, stood my family. My father was mid-laugh, holding a tumbler of scotch, surrounded by a circle of international investors. When the heavy silence hit the room, he turned. The color drained from Mitchell's face so fast, he looked as though he might physically collapse. His jaw slackened, the amber liquid tilting dangerously in his glass. Beside him, my mother, Diane, froze. She was wearing an icy silver gown, playing the role of the triumphant matriarch to absolute perfection until she saw me. Diane's eyes bulged with raw, unfiltered horror. Her hands flew to her throat, her knuckles white. She was entirely mortified that her meticulously orchestrated narrative of the pristine, scandal-free family dynasty was walking straight toward her in a red dress. But it was Chelsea who truly lost control of her mask. She was draped on Declan's arm, wearing a custom white silk gown that aggressively screamed bridal anticipation. When her eyes locked onto mine, the smug, victorious glow she had been radiating all evening instantly incinerated. Her face contorted into a mask of white-hot, venomous fury. Her manicured fingers dug into Declan's bicep like talons. Declan, ever the arrogant tactician, tried to maintain his composure. He stiffened his shoulders, squaring, but I could see the microscopic twitch of a muscle near his jaw. His eyes darted frantically around the room, assessing the sudden public relations nightmare unfolding in front of the city's most important financial journalists. I did not stop until I was standing less than 10 feet from them, becoming the absolute epicenter of the gallery's paralyzed attention. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Mitchell recovered first, his corporate survival instincts kicking in. He thrust his scotch glass into the hands of a nearby waiter and lunged forward, closing the distance between us with aggressive, hushed urgency. He grabbed my elbow, his grip bruising, attempting to physically turn me back toward the exit. He leaned in, his voice a low, furious hiss meant only for my ears. He demanded to know what I was doing, accusing me of losing my mind, ordering me to leave the premises immediately, before I caused an irreparable scene. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my arm, my expression radiating cold, clinical disgust. I told him to remove his hand, keeping my voice entirely calm, yet pitched perfectly to carry through the dead silent room. The absolute lack of fear in my tone startled him. Mitchell hesitated, his grip loosening just a fraction. Chelsea marched forward, stepping out from Declan's shadow. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving as she struggled to keep her voice down. She called me pathetic, spitting the words through clenched teeth, accusing me of being so deeply jealous of her happiness that I would sink to crashing her engagement party. She ordered me to get out, declaring that I was embarrassing myself and ruining the most important night of their lives. I looked at my sister, taking in the desperate, furious gleam in her eyes, the white gown, the enormous diamonds sparkling on her finger. I offered her a slow, terrifying smile. I told her I wouldn't dream of missing this celebration. I looked past her locking eyes with Declan, who was staring at me with a sudden dawning sense of unease. He was an apex predator, and his instincts were finally beginning to scream that he had miscalculated. I held his gaze perfectly still, knowing that the digital snare was fully armed, waiting only for the final ink to dry. I was standing in the lion's den, but they were entirely blind to the fact that the doors had just locked from the outside. Declan's composure cracked, revealing the ruthless enforcer beneath the polished veneer. He shot a subtle, sharp hand gesture toward the perimeter. Two towering security contractors in charcoal suits detached from the wall, their earpieces glinting in the gallery's track lighting as they moved to flank me in a pincer maneuver. This was the exact kinetic response I had anticipated, the brute force application of power he relied on when his intellect failed. Before the guards could cover half the distance, Terrence materialized from the dense crowd. He did not use aggression. He weaponized the social geography of the room. Holding a brimming champagne flute, he stepped backward directly into the lead guard's path, feigning a clumsy apologetic collision that sent crystalline shards and expensive vintage spilling across the contractor's dark trousers. Apologizing profusely with exaggerated embarrassment, Terrence loudly drew the attention of three nearby state senators, transforming a discreet removal operation into a highly visible, incredibly awkward spectacle. The guards froze, caught in a paralyzing protocol loop between physically shoving a respected community director in front of elected officials and executing Declan's silent kill order. The distraction was brief, a momentary glitch in their operational tempo, but in the realm of digital warfare, 3 seconds was an eternity. I did not wait to watch the fallout. I pivoted on my heel, the crimson silk of my gown swirling around my legs, and melted into the chaotic throng of distracted elites. I moved with urgent, invisible purpose, bypassing the main exhibition floor and slipping through a restricted access door near the catering bays. The Lumina Gallery's audiovisual control booth was perched on a suspended mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom, accessible only via a narrow, dimly lit spiral staircase. I climbed the metal steps rapidly, my heart hammering against my ribs, stripping away the persona of the scorned ex-wife and fully inhabiting the role of the executioner. The booth was a cramped, climate-controlled nerve center packed with mixing consoles, rack-mounted servers, and a wall of monitors displaying different closed-circuit angles of the gala. A single technician sat slouched in a wheeled swivel chair, wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones, his attention fixed on a lighting sequence monitor entirely oblivious to the interpersonal drama unfolding below. I pushed the heavy acoustic door open, closing and locking the deadbolt behind me with a solid, definitive thud. The technician flinched, pulling one headphone off his ear and spinning around with a scowl that instantly melted into profound confusion at the sight of a woman in formal evening wear invading his secure workspace. He opened his mouth to demand my credentials, raising a hand toward his radio. I did not give him the opportunity to articulate a single syllable. I stepped forward, gripping the back of his chair and violently rolling him away from the primary control board. I flashed a counterfeit credential bearing the event management company's logo, leaning in close with an expression of pure, unadulterated authority. I informed him in a rapid, icy tone that there was a critical Tier 1 security breach regarding the venture fund's promotional feed and that he was legally mandated to vacate the console immediately by direct order of Vanguard Freight's executive board. The sheer velocity and aggressive certainty of my command stripped him of his defenses. He stammered, raising his hands in surrender, and backed slowly away from the desk. I pointed to the far corner of the room, ordering him to stand there and remain absolutely silent unless he wanted to face immediate litigation. He obeyed, thoroughly neutralized by the hostile takeover. I slid into the still warm leather chair, my fingers flying over the illuminated keys of the master mixing board. This was my undisputed domain. The gallery utilized a centralized matrix routing system to manage the massive visual arrays throughout the venue. I bypassed the standard event playlist, isolating the HDMI input routing protocols for the main stage. Within 40 seconds, I had mapped my encrypted burner phone, which was actively mirroring my motel room server directly into the gallery's primary display matrix. The connection established a silent, dormant tether, waiting only for my final keystroke. Through the soundproof glass of the observation window, I looked down at the ballroom. Down on the floor, the security guards had finally extracted themselves from Terrence's orchestrated mess, looking around in bewilderment. Declan, assuming I had been quietly escorted off the premises by his men and eager to regain absolute control of the narrative, was marching up the steps toward the main stage. The ambient chatter of the crowd began to quiet as he tapped the microphone, the sound reverberating through the vast space. He stood directly beneath an enormous high-definition LED wall that was currently projecting the sleek, minimalist gold logo of his newly minted venture capital fund. Chelsea was positioned in the front row, looking smug and triumphant, her arm linked tightly with my father's. Declan's voice boomed through the gallery's line array speakers, dripping with manufactured charisma and predatory confidence. He welcomed the titans of industry, the local politicians, and the assembled financial journalists. He spoke grandly about the future of decentralized logistics, about forging a new, unstoppable empire, about vision and unyielding legacy. He painted himself as a pioneer, a man who saw the invisible currents of global capital and bent them entirely to his will. The audience was enraptured, hanging on his every arrogant, self-aggrandizing word. My father nodded along vigorously, his chest puffed out, reveling in his proximity to such vast theoretical wealth. Declan raised both hands, signaling the climax of his keynote address. He officially announced the Vanguard Apex merger, describing it as the largest, most disruptive corporate acquisition in the history of commercial freight. The room erupted into enthusiastic, thunderous applause. It was the perfect, agonizing moment to pull the pin. I hit the execution command on the master console. The applause died instantly as the massive LED wall behind Declan suffered a catastrophic visual failure. The bright, pristine gold logo vanished, plunging the entire stage into abrupt, disorienting darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, the sudden absence of light triggering a primal wave of unease. Declan frowned, his smile faltering as he tapped his microphone, turning his head to look over his shoulder at the dead screen. He snapped his fingers impatiently, gesturing angrily up toward the control booth, expecting the technician to immediately rectify the glitch. Instead, the screen flared back to life with blinding intensity. But it was not displaying the venture capital logo. The entire 60-foot LED wall illuminated with the stark utilitarian interface of my live desktop feed. The harsh white light of the raw directory washed over Declan, casting long, severe shadows across the stage and illuminating his sudden look of terror. A cursor blinked in the center of the massive display, rhythmic and ominous. Displayed for the entire room of investors, reporters, and politicians was the raw, unedited directory of the Sovereign Ledger Protocol. I opened the main payload file, filling the colossal screen with the exact classified smart contract my father and Declan had authorized mere hours ago. The trap was no longer a silent string of code buried in the blockchain. It was 60 feet tall, blaring its truth to the world and entirely impossible to ignore. I reached across the mixing console and wrapped my fingers around the heavy steel base of the primary broadcast microphone. I depressed the transmission toggle, seamlessly overriding the gallery's audio matrix and instantly severing the feed to Declan's lapel mic. Down on the stage, he tapped the dead plastic clipped to his tuxedo, his mouth moving in a silent, desperate pantomime of authority. He looked up toward the observation window, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pierce the dark glass of the control booth. I leaned into the microphone. My voice dropped from the vaulted ceiling like a physical weight, cold, amplified, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria they had relied upon to discredit me. I did not mention the divorce. I did not waste a single syllable on my shattered marriage, Chelsea's white dress, or the interpersonal betrayals that had brought us to this precipice. Those grievances were trivial, the petty dramas of small-minded people. I was not there to play the role of the scorned woman. I was there to deliver a forensic autopsy of their criminal empire. I commanded the crowd to direct their attention to the 60-foot screen illuminating the stage. With a few rapid keystrokes, I manipulated the display, stripping away the complex hexadecimal code of the smart contract and replacing it with a crystalline high-definition data visualization. I pulled up the hidden architectural framework of the Vanguard Apex merger, projecting a sprawling, interconnected web of international wire transfers. The diagram mapped the exact flow of the venture capital funds they had just solicited from the very people standing in the room. I narrated the progression of their capital, speaking in the ruthless clinical cadence of a federal prosecutor. I traced the money from their initial investments into Vanguard's primary holding accounts, demonstrating precisely how Declan utilized automated routing algorithms to siphon 50% of the liquid capital into ghost subsidiaries. I projected the registration documents for these offshore entities, highlighting the Cayman Island and Panamanian bank routing numbers that matched Declan and Mitchell's private portfolios. A low, dangerous murmur began to ripple through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The political elite and hedge fund managers ceased staring at me and began staring at the undeniable, deeply authenticated bank records glowing above the stage. Declan was shouting now, waving frantically at his security detail, demanding they breach the control booth. I ignored him, my fingers flying across the keyboard to advance the presentation to the most damning piece of the puzzle. I split the massive LED wall, bringing up a series of high-resolution PDFs. These were the internal tax documents and operational ledgers for the Horizon Community Housing Initiative, the nonprofit run by my former father-in-law, Terrence. I zoomed in on the signature lines, placing them side by side with verified cryptographic signatures extracted from Vanguard's internal network. I explained methodically and dispassionately how Mitchell and Declan had weaponized the charity. I detailed the mechanics of their laundering operation, forging Terrence's signature to create phantom community development grants using the nonprofit's tax-exempt status to wash the stolen venture capital and subsequently routing the clean money out through falsified vendor contracts. I highlighted the digital timestamps proving definitively that the forgeries had been executed from Declan's personal IP address authorized by Mitchell's administrative credentials. The crowd's murmur morphed into a chaotic, volatile hum of outrage. They were not witnessing a family dispute. They were looking at ironclad evidence of wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and multiple violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. To completely incinerate any lingering possibility of plausible deniability, I cued the final payload. Document trails could be contested by expensive lawyers. Digital signatures could be blamed on rogue hackers. But hubris is impossible to forge. I triggered an audio file, routing it through the gallery's concert-grade surround sound system. It was the raw, unedited recording from the afternoon they had expelled me from my own life, captured perfectly by the hidden acoustic software I had left running on Declan's home server. Mitchell's voice boomed through the gallery, dripping with condescension and arrogant certainty. The recording captured him explicitly, detailing the mechanics of the fraud, boasting about the vulnerability of the venture fund's investors. He laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that filled the grand ballroom, calling the assembled elite a collection of gullible sheep begging to be sheared. Declan's voice followed crisp and confident, outlining exactly how the smart contract would bypass federal oversight and secure their offshore payout before anyone realized the funds were missing. The audio severed the last threads of civility in the room. The polished veneer of the gala disintegrated into absolute panic. The elite investors, recognizing the voices of their betrayers, confirming the theft of their wealth, abandoned their champagne flutes. Glasses shattered against the polished concrete. A synchronized, frantic wave of movement overtook the crowd as dozens of state senators, portfolio managers, and socialites simultaneously ripped their cell phones from their pockets and evening bags. The ballroom dissolved into a chaotic cacophony of desperate phone calls. They were screaming at wealth managers, demanding emergency holds from offshore brokers, and calling retained legal counsel, utterly terrified by the realization that their money had already been processed through the very smart contract I had just displayed. Down on the floor, the psychological toll of the exposure finally broke Mitchell. The facade of the untouchable corporate titan crumbled, replaced by the sheer primal panic of a trapped animal. He looked at the furious advancing crowd of billionaires he had just publicly robbed. He did not look at his daughter standing paralyzed in her engagement gown. He did not look at his wife weeping in the center of the room. He abandoned them instantly, spinning on his heel and sprinting toward the heavy brass-handled oak doors at the main entrance. He hit the exit at a full run, throwing his shoulder against the wood. The doors did not yield. He grabbed the brass handles, yanking them with brutal, desperate force, his face red and contorted. From the control booth, I watched his futile struggle. The Lumina Gallery housed millions of dollars in contemporary art, and its security infrastructure was designed to prevent high-stakes theft. The moment I had locked down the AV booth, I had also engaged the building's perimeter defense protocol. The magnetic maglocks on every external exit had sealed with 2,000 pounds of holding force. Mitchell slammed his fists against the immovable oak, turning his head to look back at the mob of furious investors closing in on him. He was locked inside the cage, and he was entirely out of options. I stepped out of the climate-controlled isolation of the AV booth, pushing open the heavy acoustic door to stand on the narrow steel mezzanine that hung suspended over the ballroom. The atmosphere below was a toxic vapor of spilled champagne, expensive perfume, and pure, unfiltered terror. Mitchell was still frantically rattling the unyielding brass handles of the main exit, his face contorted in a mask of primal desperation. But it was my sister who saw me first. Chelsea's eyes tracked the origin of the audio feed upward, locking onto the vibrant crimson silk of my gown against the dark industrial grating of the balcony. The shock on her face evaporated instantly, replaced by a feral, unhinged fury. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek that cut through the chaotic din of 100 panicked billionaires. Lifting the heavy layers of her white designer engagement gown, she abandoned her paralyzed fiancé and charged toward the base of the spiral staircase. Her manicured hands gripped the iron railing, her knuckles turning white as she began to tear up the steps toward me, screaming raw obscenities. She managed exactly 3 steps before the structural integrity of the gallery's main entrance was violently compromised. The massive oak doors, which had resolutely defied my father's frantic pulling, did not swing outward. They were blown inward with deafening concussive force. A heavy tactical ram shattered the brass locking mechanism, sending jagged splinters of ancient wood and twisted metal raining across the polished concrete floor. Mitchell was thrown backward by the kinetic shockwave, landing hard on his spine among the ruined remains of the barricade. Through the billowing cloud of pulverized drywall and wood dust, a tidal wave of matte black tactical gear flooded the exhibition floor. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the perimeter, their movements sharp, coordinated, and utterly overwhelming. Heavily armed FBI strike teams secured the exits with clinical efficiency, while stern-faced IRS criminal investigation operatives fanned out across the room. They shouted precise, booming orders that instantly silenced the panicked elite demanding total compliance. The absolute authority in their voices turned the gallery into a frozen, terrified tableau. Chelsea halted on the spiral staircase, her pristine white dress coated in a fine layer of gray dust, her mouth hanging open as a tactical laser sight briefly swept across her chest. From my elevated vantage point, I watched the sea of dark uniforms part with military precision to allow two figures to step through the ruined entryway. The first was a tall, uncompromising woman wearing a federal windbreaker bearing the gold crest of the Treasury Department. The second was Terrence. He was no longer the humbled, pragmatic community director carefully navigating the treacherous waters of my family's towering ego. The posture of deferential submission he had weaponized for months was completely gone. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored suit. He looked over the devastated ballroom with the cool, analytical detachment of an architect evaluating a highly successful controlled demolition. He walked shoulder to shoulder with the lead agent, pausing only to look down at Mitchell. My father was currently scrambling backward like a crab on the floor, trying desperately to escape the heavy boots of the advancing strike team. Terrence offered him a tight, razor-thin smile, a silent acknowledgement of total victory. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic reveals. Terrence had executed his role flawlessly. 7 days prior, utilizing the full ironclad protection of a federal whistleblower statute, he had walked into a regional FBI field office and handed over the master drive containing the encrypted logs of the Horizon Community Housing Initiative. He had delivered the structural blueprints of their fraud directly to the Department of Justice, providing them with the undeniable probable cause required to secure the warrants now being served with extreme prejudice. On the main stage, Declan remained frozen near the center of the platform, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic surrender. A tight ring of armed federal agents surrounded him, cutting off any avenue of retreat. His eyes darted wildly, seeking an impossible escape route, but the gallery was locked down tight. Then the final phase of my digital guillotine engaged. Above Declan, the 60-foot LED wall shifted. The static images of the forged tax documents dissolved, replaced by a massive high-contrast command terminal reflecting the live status of the Sovereign Ledger Protocol smart contract. The cryptographic signatures they had so eagerly provided less than 12 hours ago had acted as the irreversible trigger. The interface displayed the unyielding routing protocols initiating the transfer of the $400 million acquisition capital. A booming synthetic chime echoed through the gallery's concert-grade sound system as the transaction status updated from pending to executing. The screen split into two towering digital readouts prominently displaying Mitchell's and Declan's centralized offshore holding accounts. In real time, beneath the unforgiving glare of the gallery lights and the watchful eyes of the federal government, the staggering numbers began to rapidly spool backward. Millions of dollars cascaded downward in a chaotic blur of shifting red digits. The algorithm I had hard-coded into the merger was ruthlessly efficient. Because of the IRS Title 26 forfeiture protocol I had embedded in the contract, the system legally categorized the transfer as a voluntary compliance surrender of criminal proceeds. It seized every asset, dissolved every ghost subsidiary, and redirected the illicit capital straight into the heavily fortified seizure vaults of the United States Treasury. Declan let out a guttural, suffocated sound, his legs giving out beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, ignoring the agents surrounding him, forced to watch his entire empire vaporize pixel by pixel. Mitchell lay flat on his back near the ruined doors, paralyzed by shock, staring up at the colossal screen as the wealth that defined his entire existence plummeted. 50 million, 20 million, 5 million. The digits spun furiously until they slammed to a violent halt. The screen flashed a final absolute confirmation. Both accounts rested permanently, legally, and irreversibly at zero. The federal agents did not hesitate, their movements a masterclass in kinetic, overwhelming subdual. Heavy tactical boots crunched over the shattered oak and twisted brass of the gallery doors. Two operatives detached from the main assault formation and descended upon Mitchell, hoisting his dead weight from the pulverized drywall. My father offered zero resistance. His limbs were entirely limp, his eyes wide and terribly vacant as thick nylon zip ties were ratcheted around his wrists. The sharp mechanical clicking sound pierced the ambient chaos of the ballroom. A Treasury investigator stood over him reciting his Miranda rights in a flat, unyielding monotone that listed federal wire fraud, racketeering, and grand larceny. Mitchell's mouth opened and closed silently, unable to process the total vaporization of his existence. On the main stage, Declan's subjugation was far less gentle. He was an apex predator cornered, and the strike team treated him accordingly. A heavy, gloved hand slammed between his shoulder blades, driving his chest violently into the polished wooden floorboards of the dais. The cold, unforgiving steel of federal handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, biting deep into the expensive fabric of his tailored tuxedo. An FBI special agent hauled him roughly to his knees. The rights being read to him echoed through the cavernous space, a surreal, grim counter-narrative to the triumphant keynote address he had delivered only minutes prior. At the periphery of this tactical sweep, my mother's meticulously curated reality violently fractured. Diane had spent 4 decades constructing an impenetrable fortress of social superiority, shielding herself from the consequences of my father's greed. Watching him hauled up like a common street criminal shattered her psychological armor instantly. She let out a piercing, ragged wail, dropping to her knees amid the shattered champagne flutes and trampled hors d'oeuvres. Her icy silver gown absorbed the spilled vintage wine as she clawed at the trousers of the passing agents, begging them to stop screaming that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. The agents bypassed her without a downward glance, treating her hysterical collapse as a mere environmental hazard. She was left sobbing on the polished concrete, her pristine socialite mask dissolving into running mascara and raw, unfiltered terror. From the mezzanine staircase, Chelsea observed the total annihilation of her future. The white silk of her custom engagement gown was smeared with the gray dust of the breached doors, perfectly mirroring the sudden ash of her ambitions. The digital counter on the massive screen above still read 0. The billions were gone. The status was gone. The dynasty was officially a federal crime scene. Survival instinct, primitive and intensely calculating, overtook her panic. She scrambled down the remaining metal steps, her eyes darting frantically through the sea of dark tactical uniforms, until she locked onto the only figure of authority not currently holding a weapon. She spotted Terrence. Chelsea lunged towards him, nearly tripping over the hem of her ruined dress. She threw herself at the older man, her manicured hands grasping desperately at the lapels of his suit. Tears, summoned with the terrifying speed of a seasoned manipulator, spilled down her flushed cheeks. She begged him to intervene, to use his influence and connections to stop the raid. She invoked the sacred bonds of family, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. She placed a protective, dramatic hand over her flat stomach, playing her ultimate trump card. She sobbed, pleading with him to save Declan for the sake of his unborn grandchild, for the innocent life caught in the crossfire of this corporate warfare. Terrence did not flinch. He did not step back, nor did he offer a comforting embrace. He simply looked down at the hands gripping his lapels with an expression of profound, glacial pity. Operating with the same invisible efficiency he had used to dismantle their financial architecture, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, folded sheaf of legal paper bound with a blue backing cover. Gently but firmly, he pried her fingers off his jacket and pressed the document into her hands. She stared down at the paper, the tears momentarily stalling. It was a finalized divorce petition drafted, signed by an emergency judge, and fully executed. Terrence's voice was a low, resonant hum that cut cleanly through the surrounding noise. He informed her that he knew about the rushed confidential courthouse signatures she and Declan had filed that very morning to legally lock in their union prior to the massive capital influx of the merger. It had been a tactical play to secure her position as a primary stakeholder before the ink dried. Terrence calmly explained that as Declan's legally appointed power of attorney for all non-corporate entities, a fail-safe his arrogant son had neglected to revoke, he was exercising his right to nullify the union immediately on the grounds of acute documented fraud. Chelsea's mouth opened, a defensive scream forming on her lips, but Terence raised a single commanding finger, silencing her. He did not stop at the financial deception. He dropped the final devastating weight of his counteroffensive. He revealed that when he had handed the master drive over to the Department of Justice under whistleblower protection, he hadn't just audited the charity's ledgers. He had audited the people attempting to hijack it. He looked directly into her panicked eyes and stated that he had subpoenaed the private medical records from the elite boutique clinic she claimed to be visiting for her prenatal care. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the tactical raid happening feet away. Terence delivered the clinical truth without a shred of malice, offering only absolute finality. The records confirmed what he had suspected from the moment she weaponized her womb. The pregnancy was entirely fictional. There was no baby. There was no heir to the Vanguard empire. It was a phantom, a desperate, intricately woven lie she had concocted for the sole purpose of legally binding Declan's theoretical assets to her before the merger was finalized. Chelsea stood frozen, the divorce petition trembling in her hands, her ultimate manipulation dragged into the unforgiving light. Her chest heaved, but she had absolutely nothing left to say. Her leverage, her false innocence, and her stolen future were eradicated in a single stroke. 10 feet away on the main stage, the FBI agents paused, hauling Declan to his feet. He had heard every word. The arrogant tactician, the man who believed he could outmaneuver global markets and crush my existence without a second thought, turned his head to look at his bride. The realization that he had been conned by someone utilizing the exact same predatory opportunism he wielded hit him with physical force. The color drained completely from his face. Handcuffed, his billion-dollar empire seized, and his freedom permanently gone. Declan stared at Chelsea. There was no heartbreak in his eyes, only a hollow absolute and suffocating disgust. The justice system, usually a sluggish, lumbering beast, when dealing with the ultra-wealthy, moved with terrifying, unprecedented velocity. The sheer volume of cryptographic evidence I had dumped onto the Lumina Gallery's main screen, coupled with Terence's meticulously catalogued master drive, left the defense attorneys with absolutely nothing but scorched earth. 6 months evaporated. The grueling cycle of federal indictments, arraignments, and heavily publicized trials dominated the national financial news cycle, but I watched it all from a serene, untouchable distance. The gavel falls echoed with a satisfying, permanent finality. Mitchell, the man who had traded his own flesh and blood for a seat at a phantom table, was handed a 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The corporate survival instincts he had honed over decades in corner offices proved entirely useless within the concrete walls of his new reality. He was stripped of his bespoke armor, his offshore accounts, and his unearned arrogance. Declan received 40 years. The architect of the Vanguard Apex fraud was reduced to a 9-digit federal inmate number, his brilliant sociopathic mind permanently locked in a cage where his manipulation held zero currency. Even my mother Diane could not escape the blast radius of her own complicity. Her signature, willingly provided to authorize the transfer of fraudulent assets to shelter them from early IRS audits, earned her a 15-year stretch. The pristine, scandal-free dynasty she had murdered my soul to protect dissolved into a spectacular, historic disgrace. And then there was Chelsea. The federal prosecutors did not bother bringing criminal charges against my sister. The complete, instantaneous evaporation of her lifestyle was a far more agonizing punishment. Stripped of Declan's theoretical wealth and hit with an avalanche of civil suits from furious, ruined investors who targeted anyone adjacent to the Vanguard board, she was buried beneath an insurmountable mountain of legal debt. The custom silk gowns and curated social media perfection were violently replaced by the harsh fluorescent reality of a late-night diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. I had hired a discreet private investigator, purely out of a clinical need for absolute closure, to verify her status. The photographs delivered to my secure inbox showed my sister wearing a grease-stained polyester uniform, her perfectly highlighted hair tied back in a ragged net. She was working the grueling graveyard shift, slinging cheap coffee and wiping down sticky laminate tables for minimum wage and sparse tips. her youth and manufactured innocence grinding away under the crushing weight of genuine, inescapable consequence. While they burned, I rebuilt. I left the ashes of that city behind and relocated to Chicago, drawn by the sharp, unforgiving architecture and the relentless kinetic energy of the financial district. I did not return to the shadows of cheap motels, nor did I hide behind anonymous blockchain transactions. Instead, I stepped fully into the light. Terrence and I formalized the quiet, lethal synergy we had developed during our clandestine operation. We signed the lease on a pristine, glass-walled office suite, occupying the top floor of a high-rise in the Loop. We launched an elite, highly specialized forensic auditing and digital security firm. We became the apex predators of the financial sector. Corporations, international banks, and massive charitable foundations retained us to perform deep-dive structural audits, hunting for the exact type of parasitic vulnerabilities Declan and Mitchell had exploited. Terrence handled the complex social engineering and human intelligence networking, while I dismantled their digital infrastructure line by line. We were not just thriving, we were feared and universally respected. We built an uncompromising reputation for finding the absolute truth, no matter how deeply it was encrypted or how aggressively it was hidden by powerful, desperate men. The revenue was legitimate, substantial, and entirely mine. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months to the day since the raid at the Lumina Gallery. I arrived at the office early, long before the administrative staff or our team of junior analysts. The high-rise was quiet, the air sharp and still. I walked across the polished marble floor of my private office, the heels of my shoes clicking with a steady, authoritative rhythm. I set my briefcase on the massive, live-edge mahogany desk and poured a cup of black coffee. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of Lake Michigan. My personal cell phone resting on the smooth wood of the desk vibrated with a short, sharp buzz. The screen illuminated the dim morning shadows. I picked up the device. The incoming message was from an unknown, unsaved number, but the desperate, chaotic syntax was instantly recognizable. I stared at the glowing pixels. "Paige, it's Chelsea." The text read, the digital letters practically vibrating with exhaustion. "I know you hate me. I know what I did. But they are taking my apartment today. I haven't eaten a real meal in 2 days. I have absolutely nothing left. Please, I am begging you. Can you just send me $50? I stood there in the quiet sanctuary of my empire, reading the pathetic, groveling plea from the woman who had happily tried to bury me alive. There was a time in a previous lifetime when reading those words would have triggered a paralyzing wave of guilt, a familial obligation to rescue my sister from her own toxic choices. But that version of Paige had died in a dusty room, burned away by the digital fire that had forged the woman standing here today. I did not feel anger. I did not feel pity. I felt a profound, absolute tranquility. A slow, cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. I pressed my thumb against the screen, swiping left across the notification. I tapped the red trash can icon. The message vanished into the digital void, permanently deleted, leaving behind a blank, pristine screen. I set the phone face down on the mahogany desk, severing the final pathetic tether to my past. I picked up my coffee and walked around the desk, stepping right up to the edge of the towering glass wall. Below me, the city of Chicago was waking up, a sprawling, intricate grid of millions of intersecting lives and boundless opportunities. The early morning sky fractured into brilliant shades of violet gold and piercing victorious crimson. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air, raised my chin, and turned my chair to face the sun rising over the boundless, magnificent skyline. The most profound takeaway from this narrative is the liberating power of severing toxic familial tethers. We are often conditioned to believe that bloodlines demand unconditional loyalty, even when that loyalty requires our own destruction. However, true security isn't inherited, it is fiercely cultivated through self-respect and impenetrable boundaries. Walking away from exploitation is not an act of malice, but an essential step toward authentic self-preservation. When you stop seeking validation from those determined to diminish you, you reclaim the authority to author your own future. Evaluate your relationships and boldly redefine the boundaries that protect your peace. Share your journey and comment below.